Welcome, dear subscribers and curious listeners of my channel. Today we're going to talk about what was left behind the scenes of the film Order of the Phoenix. Despite being based on the longest book in the entire series, the film turned out to be the shortest. As a result, many important moments, especially those involving Umbridge, never made it to the screen. But if you've read the books, you know this woman was far more sinister than the movie showed. So let's revisit her most disturbing actions that never made it to the big screen. Enjoy watching. Number 1. The attack on Hagrid and McGonagall. One of the darkest and most disturbing episodes is the scene where Umbridge came to arrest Hagrid. She arrived at his hut in the middle of the night with a team of Ministry enforcers. All of it happened in full view of the students who were taking their astronomy exams at the time. Hagrid didn't comply, so they fired spells at him. As a half-giant, he withstood the assault and even managed to toss a few of his attackers aside. Professor McGonagall rushed out to help him and was promptly struck down by a barrage of spells. She was severely injured and had to be hospitalized at St. Mungo's for weeks of recovery. This scene was completely cut from the film, yet it powerfully shows how far Umbridge's cruelty extended, even toward her colleagues. Number 2. The Special Ink. The film briefly shows Umbridge punishing Harry by making him write, "I must not tell lies," but viewers might not grasp the full horror of the scene. In the book, it becomes clear that Harry isn't writing with regular ink. Each word is carved into his skin, and the letters leave behind bloody wounds. And it wasn't a one-time thing. Harry sat in Umbridge's office for hours, over and over again, carving the same phrase into his hand. It was systematic abuse, almost like torture, and Umbridge clearly enjoyed the process. In the film, this moment is portrayed as a symbolic punishment. In the book, it's a painful, physical, and emotional torment. Number 3. The Inquisitorial Squad. This part also appears briefly in the movie, but so shallowly that many viewers barely notice it. Yet in the book, it's one of the most chilling signs of Umbridge's reign. She created the Inquisitorial Squad, a group of students personally loyal to her. Most were Slytherins, including Malfoy. These kids were given power over their peers, deducting house points, reporting on students, reading their mail, even interfering with private matters. Hermione, for instance, was penalized just for her blood status. The squad operated without oversight or limits. It was a true miniature dictatorship where children were encouraged to spy on and bully one another. The film completely misses this oppressive atmosphere, but in the book, it's present throughout the school year. Number 4. The Quidditch ban. One of Umbridge's most unfair actions was banning Harry, George, and Fred Weasley from playing Quidditch. After a clash with Malfoy, who, as usual, provoked the fight, Harry and George lost their temper and attacked him. Instead of a typical punishment, Umbridge intervened with a harsh sentence. None of them were allowed to play again. Fred was punished simply by association. Malfoy and his gang, of course, faced no consequences. This entire storyline was cut from the film. Quidditch didn't appear at all in Order of the Phoenix, but it mattered. For Harry, the game was his only escape, his one way to feel alive amid growing pressure. Number 5. The attack on Hedwig. Umbridge wouldn't stop at anything. Obsessed with controlling Harry, she tried to intercept his letters. When standard methods failed, she took it a step further and attacked his owl, Hedwig. We don't know exactly how she managed it, but the aftermath spoke volumes. Hedwig returned wounded, her wing damaged, feathers ruffled. This shows just how far Umbridge was willing to go, even hurting an innocent animal, to get what she wanted. This moment was also left out of the film, though it reveals how brutal and heartless this woman truly was. Number 6. Interrogations with Veritaserum. Dolores Umbridge sat across from Harry, her smile tight, her tone falsely kind. "You've been communicating with dangerous individuals, haven't you?" she said softly. Then she reached for the small vial on her desk, clear, shimmering, and deadly honest. Veritaserum. Using it on students was strictly forbidden, but Umbridge didn't care. "A few drops and we'll have the truth," she said. She wasn't asking. She was preparing to drug a child to force out secrets. That was her idea of justice. Only one thing stopped her: Severus Snape. When she demanded more Veritaserum, he said coldly, "You've used up my entire stock, and it takes a full moon cycle to brew." Earlier, he had quietly given her a diluted batch, knowing what she planned. Harry drank nothing. The interrogation failed, but the intention remained. Umbridge had crossed a line even Voldemort rarely did. She tried to poison a student not out of rage, but out of cold, bureaucratic calculation. And she did it without blinking. Number 8. The Hunt for Centaurs. Dolores Umbridge always claimed to uphold law and order, but her idea of order left no room for those she considered lesser. Centaurs, beings of wisdom and pride, were to her nothing more than wild animals. "They're dangerous, uncivilized," she once muttered when overhearing Firenze's name. When she marched into the Forbidden Forest to interrogate Harry, Hermione, and the Centaurs themselves, she carried not respect, but a wand and arrogance. She cast offensive spells, ignoring every warning, every plea. She called them filthy half-breeds, out loud, without hesitation. The words cracked like whips in the stillness of the trees. Even Hermione froze. The Centaurs, led by Bane and Megorian, reacted with fury. They had endured disrespect from wizards before, but this was different. This was intrusion, attack, and insult combined. "You dare!" Megorian thundered, his eyes glowing. It wasn't a battle, it was retribution. Umbridge was seized and dragged screaming into the forest. She called for help. No one followed. Later, she refused to speak of what happened, but everyone knew. What mattered wasn't just the punishment she received, it was what caused it. Umbridge treated magical beings not as equals, but as threats to be controlled. That moment in the forest wasn't a mistake. It was the natural end of her belief that power made her superior, and in that dark, tangled wood, she learned, too late, that some beings answer cruelty with justice. Number 9. Humiliation of Dissenters. Dolores Umbridge stood at the front of the staff room with a clipboard and a smirk. As Hogwarts' new High Inquisitor, she had invented a scoring system for teachers. But it was never about improvement. It was about humiliation. "Inadequate," she wrote beside Professor Trelawney's name. "Too emotional," she marked under Sprout. These weren't evaluations, they were weapons. And every check mark on her parchment was another blow to the school's heart. Professor Flitwick, one of the most respected and kind-hearted teachers, was first to feel the sting. After a series of inspections, he quietly cut back his lessons. No more advanced charm work, no more joyful experiments. "I find your methods unnecessarily flamboyant," Umbridge had said. He nodded and smiled politely, but behind his eyes was defeat. Students noticed. The laughter faded from his classroom. The spark was dimmed. Professor Sprout fared no better. Her greenhouses were combed through daily. Umbridge once accused her of cultivating subversive ideas after she found a student project on magical plant communication. Sprout stood her ground, but even she began speaking less. In staff meetings, the professors weren't just being silenced, they were being shrunk. Their voices softened, their colors faded. Umbridge didn't need to fire them. She made them erase themselves. That was her power. She didn't shout, she didn't duel, she destroyed from the inside, by mocking, pressuring, watching. Every teacher who valued independence became a target, and soon the school that once thrived on curiosity and debate turned cold, quiet, careful. The students looked around and saw what happened to those who dared to think differently. And they learned to stay silent. Number 10, destruction of Dumbledore's army flyers and leaflets. When Dolores Umbridge discovered the existence of Dumbledore's army, she didn't just try to shut it down, she tried to erase every trace of it. Her first order was simple: confiscate and destroy all unauthorized materials. Posters disappeared from dorm walls, secret meeting notes were snatched mid-passing, even doodles with the letters DA drawn in margins were grounds for detention. She didn't just want silence. She wanted forgetfulness. One afternoon, Colin Creevey was caught passing a folded parchment to a second year. He claimed it was just a schedule for tutoring. The paper was snatched, incinerated, and Colin spent the next night scrubbing floors with a toothbrush. Seamus Finnegan, overheard saying DA in the hallway, was dragged into Umbridge's office and questioned for hours. "You think you're clever, do you?" she asked him, voice syrupy, eyes cold. Every act of communication became a risk. Every word could be twisted into rebellion. She banned gatherings of 3 or more students. She patrolled the owlery. Owls with letters that seemed too vague or too cheerful were intercepted. Lee Jordan tried to hang a parchment that simply said, "Hope is not illegal." It was burned. He was suspended from Quidditch commentary. Hope, in Umbridge's world, was illegal because it suggested the world didn't belong to her. The goal was clear. She didn't want to just stop Dumbledore's army. She wanted the idea of resistance to die, not with a curse or a battle, but with fear and fire. With every shredded note and scorched scrap, she whispered a warning into the walls of Hogwarts. Don't think, don't dream, obey, and the worst part? It almost worked. Number 11, spy, network, within the walls of Hogwarts. It started quietly. A whisper here, a glance there. Dolores Umbridge wasn't satisfied with the Inquisitorial squad anymore. She wanted eyes and ears everywhere, so she turned to magic. Not the kind you learn from textbooks, but the kind used for control. Enchanted portraits were told to listen. Quills moved when no one touched them. Mirrors shimmered with more than just reflections. "The Ministry's watching," read one of her new notices. It wasn't a metaphor, it was a warning. Even the common rooms weren't safe. Neville Longbottom once whispered that his letter to his gran never arrived. It simply vanished. Hermione grew so cautious, she began using enchanted coins to communicate with the members of Dumbledore's army. "She's monitoring everything," she told Harry, clutching the fake galleon like it was a lifeline. The Marauder's map, once a tool for mischief, became a weapon for survival. Every dot, every name, every movement had to be watched, because someone was watching back. Professor Flitwick, normally cheerful, started glancing nervously at the walls before speaking. Even McGonagall lowered her voice in corridors. Students stopped laughing, they stopped debating, they stopped being themselves. Fear seeped into the cracks of Hogwarts like cold through the stone walls. Every cough could be a signal, every silence could mean someone was listening. And sometimes they were. This was no longer a school. It was a prison wrapped in parchment and framed in pink. Umbridge didn't need Dementors to suck out hope. She had surveillance, suspicion, and silence. Hogwarts became a place where truth was dangerous and secrets were safer left unspoken. As Hermione later said, she doesn't just want obedience, she wants submission. And through her network of magical spies, she nearly got it. Number 12. Humiliation of Lupin. During a tense meeting with Harry Potter in Order of the Phoenix, Dolores Umbridge revealed something far more chilling than any official decree. With a pleasant smile, she leaned forward and said, "Werewolves are not the kind of creatures who ought to be near children. Wouldn't you agree?" It wasn't just a passing remark. It was a direct attack on Remus Lupin, one of the most beloved professors Hogwarts had ever seen. He wasn't even present to defend himself, and yet his name was dragged through the mud in a cold, bureaucratic tone that masked pure hatred. Remus Lupin had been a kind and brilliant teacher. In Prisoner of Azkaban, he taught Harry how to conjure a Patronus. He treated students with fairness and never once used fear to earn respect. But none of that mattered to Umbridge. To her, Lupin wasn't a gifted educator. He was simply a werewolf, a label, a danger. That word alone, in her eyes, cancelled every good deed he had ever done. Her comment wasn't just cruel. It was policy disguised as prejudice. Umbridge went further. She told Harry that the Ministry was considering stricter laws. It would be for the safety of all. Such creatures should never be trusted with authority. She didn't see the irony in her own words, that someone like her, ruthless, manipulative, openly bigoted, had power over children, while someone as compassionate as Lupin had been pushed aside. This moment, absent from the film, stripped the story of one of its most important truths. Hatred often wears a smile and carries a clipboard. It's easy to forget how dangerous Umbridge truly was when she hides behind rules and pink cardigans. But that conversation with Harry was a turning point. It showed that her evil wasn't loud like Voldemort's. Number 13, interference in exams. It was the spring of 1996, and tension at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry had reached a boiling point. The castle, once a sanctuary for learning and friendship, had transformed under the cold grip of Dolores Jane Umbridge into something unrecognizable. Behind her pink cardigans and kitten plates was a bureaucratic tyrant who thrived not only on enforcing rules but on destroying futures. Though much has been said of her punishments, her blood quills, and her disdain for Dumbledore's army, one of her cruelest and most insidious acts remains obscured from the films: her interference in the OWL examinations. The ordinary wizarding levels, better known as OWLs, were the most important academic tests for fifth-year students. The results determined not just whether a student passed a class, but what career opportunities awaited them. Auras, healers, curse breakers, none of these paths were open without high marks in the corresponding subjects. Umbridge knew this, of course. And that's precisely why she moved to sabotage the process. Control was not enough for her. She sought to wound, quietly, legally, systematically. As High Inquisitor, Umbridge had already dismantled the standard curriculum. She had banned practical defense lessons, mocked the need for real-world preparation, and sacked Professors Trelawney and Hagrid without cause. But as the OWL season approached, she turned her sights towards something even darker. Under the guise of safety, she declared that several spells, particularly in defense against the dark arts, would be too dangerous to perform during the practical portion of the exam. This decision was not based on any real risk. It was sabotage dressed in policy. In Order of the Phoenix, it is briefly mentioned that examiners from the Wizarding Examinations Authority are sent in from the Ministry, such as Griselda Marchbanks, who is said to have examined Albus Dumbledore himself. These independent officials were meant to ensure fairness, but Umbridge, drunk on her own authority, found ways to subvert them. She couldn't officially cancel the exams, she didn't have that power, but she could manipulate the conditions under which they were taken. Behind the scenes, she issued a quiet order to her Inquisitorial squad to monitor and report students who showed signs of aggression in their spellwork. Hermione Granger, who had spent months mastering nonverbal hexes and defensive charms, found herself restricted. Though her theoretical knowledge was impeccable, Hermione had intended to show proficiency in more complex spells like the Protego shield charm and even the Patronus. But these, Umbridge claimed, were high-risk spells that could endanger other students or staff. Hermione, furious but calculating, complied. Others, however, were not so fortunate. Take Susan Bones, for instance, a Hufflepuff whose aunt, Amelia Bones, worked in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. Susan had always been an average student, but in her 5th year she had blossomed under the training of Dumbledore's army. She had finally been able to cast a full-body shield charm and had practiced tirelessly for the practical exam. On the day of her defense OWL, however, she was instructed by the ministry examiner that advanced defensive spells were discouraged due to school policy. Susan panicked and defaulted to a weak stupefy. She received an A, acceptable, but it wasn't enough for the career she wanted. Even more tragic was the case of Terry Boot, a Ravenclaw whose aptitude for charms had been exemplary. He had once transfigured a full quill into a singing canary in front of Professor Flitwick. Yet during his Charms OWL, Umbridge had one of her allies, Pansy Parkinson, report him for intimidating spellwork. Terry had cast a perfectly legal disarming charm, but Pansy claimed she felt threatened. The examiner, visibly uneasy under Umbridge's watchful gaze, deducted marks. Terry, who had been predicted to earn an O outstanding, received only an A. The damage was done. This wasn't about danger, it was about control. Umbridge wanted to ensure that students she disliked, particularly those loyal to Dumbledore or Harry, failed to achieve their potential. She knew she couldn't stop them from fighting back in life, but she could place obstacles in their paths that would last for years. A low OWL mark wasn't just a disappointment, it was a dead end. Umbridge's interference wasn't always direct. She relied heavily on fear and surveillance. During the exams, she allowed members of the Inquisitorial squad to linger in the corridors near testing halls. Though they had no authority to enter the exam rooms, their presence was intimidating. Students like Dean Thomas and Seamus Finnegan reported seeing Draco Malfoy smirking and whispering outside their charms exam, clearly intending to rattle them. The message was clear: you are always being watched. What made Umbridge's tactics especially cruel was how they targeted not just individual students but entire groups. She harbored deep prejudice against half-breeds and students from what she called unreliable bloodlines. She pushed to have NEWT-level potions restricted to only those who received an outstanding at OWL level, knowing that Snape, despite his competence, was an unforgiving grader. This policy disproportionately impacted Muggle-borns, who often needed additional time to adjust to magical education but could thrive with the right instruction. Her policies were a quiet weapon against diversity. Ernie Macmillan, a determined and ambitious Hufflepuff, had planned to pursue a career in magical law. He studied obsessively and had even written to his uncle at the Department of Magical Cooperation for advice. But on the morning of his transfiguration OWL, his wand was temporarily confiscated because he had spoken out against Umbridge the week prior. Though it was returned, the psychological damage had been done. His hand shook throughout the test. He later admitted to Hannah Abbott that he had blanked on the basic switching spell. His dreams of magical jurisprudence ended that day. Umbridge did not act alone. She manipulated others into enforcing her vision. Argus Filch, always eager to punish students, was given the authority to escort students who violated decorum during exams. Several students reported being dragged out of test halls for whispered offences. In one case, a nervous Slytherin student named Malcolm Baddock was pulled out mid-exam because he had scribbled a note to himself in the margins, a habit he had developed for memory reinforcement. Filch interpreted it as cheating. Malcolm's exam was nullified. No one intervened. Number 14, Magical Torture of Cho Chang. It is a cold truth buried beneath the shining veneer of Hogwarts history. Not all acts of cruelty leave scars on the skin. Some burrow deep, silently altering the course of lives. In the glittering expanse of the 5th year at Hogwarts, one such act unfolded in shadows, never captured in the films, never given voice beyond the pages. It was an act committed not with a wand, but with a smirk and a bureaucratic pen. And it targeted a girl who had already lost too much. Cho Chang, Ravenclaw seeker, grieving daughter, and the flickering hope in Harry Potter's heart, became a silent casualty of Dolores Umbridge's iron regime. While the films painted Cho as a traitor, crushed under the weight of Veritaserum, J.K. Rowling's text tells a story far darker. The truth serum, used only sparingly in canon, was not the culprit. In fact, in Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, Severus Snape made it clear during one of Harry's detentions, "You have no idea," he sneered, "how hard it is to brew true Veritaserum. 3 drops would have you spilling your innermost secrets for hours." And even so, he refused to supply it when Umbridge requested it, fearing what she might do with the potion. Cho Chang's betrayal, if it can be called that, came not through a potion slipped into her drink, but through the crumbling of spirit under immense pressure. The Inquisitorial squad, led by students like Draco Malfoy and Pansy Parkinson, assisted Umbridge in her interrogations. They roamed the halls like predators with badges, and Cho, having only recently lost Cedric Diggory to Voldemort's return, became an easy target. She was vulnerable, and her vulnerability made her dangerous. She had been seen spending time with Harry. She was, in Umbridge's eyes, suspicious by association. The exact details of her interrogation are never described moment by moment, but Rowling leaves us with enough to construct the scene. Umbridge had full control over the school and had imposed a regime of fear so absolute that even teachers like Professor McGonagall were rendered helpless. It was made clear that students were being interviewed in Umbridge's office behind closed doors. The door always clicked shut, the walls were always silent, and those who emerged rarely spoke of what had happened. But they came out changed. Cho was no exception. The book notes the bitter tension that followed her encounter with Umbridge. After the DA, the Dumbledore's army, was discovered, Harry's gaze toward Cho grew cold. She must have told, he thought, his chest tight with betrayal. But what he didn't know, and what the films refused to show, was that Cho was not the one who had spoken at all. It was her friend Marietta Edgecombe, another Ravenclaw whose mother worked at the Ministry. It was Marietta who revealed the truth, but under pressure, under threat. The girls had been targeted together. Marietta, in a panic, exposed the DA meetings. Her betrayal was instantaneous and clear. Her face broke out in boils that spelled sneak, thanks to Hermione's jinxed parchment. But even then she refused to speak freely. When questioned by Kingsley Shacklebolt, then working undercover in the Ministry, he cast a memory-modifying charm on her to prevent her from revealing too much. Still, Umbridge knew what she wanted to know. She didn't need Veritaserum. She needed fear. Cho's guilt was presumed. Not only was she friends with Marietta, but she had also defended her afterward. When Harry confronted her, hurt and confused, she snapped. Her voice trembled with frustration, not guilt. She hadn't betrayed anyone, but her pleas were met with silence. No one thought to ask how deeply Umbridge had reached into her mind. The films robbed Cho of her complexity. They gave her a role to serve the plot and cast her aside. But the book tells us she cried. Often, not just for Cedric, not just for Harry, but for herself, caught in the gears of a machine she couldn't stop. Dolores Umbridge, unlike Voldemort, did not need to kill to destroy. She used detention slips and educational decrees like daggers. When Cho was brought into her office, the walls were pink, the kittens on the plates meowed silently, and a clipboard awaited her trembling signature. Officially, nothing happened. Officially, she was just asked a few questions, but unofficially the pressure was unbearable. "Loyalty to the Ministry," Umbridge would whisper, "is loyalty to order." There is reason to believe, from the subtext of the book, that Umbridge leveraged Marietta's family connection as a weapon. Her mother worked for the Floo Network Authority, a position easily threatened by Umbridge's power. Marietta's silence, her withdrawn behavior, her refusal to speak to Harry even after being jinxed, suggests she was terrified, not of him, but of what would happen if she said more. And Cho, she was caught between friendship and fear. Rowling offers no redemption arc for Cho in the book. That is perhaps the most painful part. She is left isolated, misunderstood, and eventually forgotten. By the time the war begins in earnest, Cho has become a shadow. A student who once smiled during Quidditch practices, who shared tea with Harry in the room of requirement, was now just another face in the crowd. Not evil, not brave, just a girl crushed under tyranny. And what of Umbridge? She never paid for that crime. Not really. Her cruelty was evident to all, but her subtle psychological manipulations, especially against Cho, went unpunished. It's easy to hate Umbridge for what she did to Harry with the blood quill, but it's harder and more important to recognize her systemic terror. She didn't need magic to torture, she only needed authority. Harry's failure to see Cho's pain is understandable. He was a boy broken by trauma himself, but it remains a scar on their story. In one moment, their bond shattered. Cho's tearful explanations were seen as excuses. The boy who lived could not see the girl who survived. Number 15. Return to the Ministry and the hunt for Muggle-borns. Of all the dark chapters in the history of the Second Wizarding War, few are as deeply unsettling as the role Dolores Umbridge played after the fall of the Ministry to Lord Voldemort. While the films gloss over her fate following her removal from Hogwarts, the books hint at her survival and resurgence. In truth, her influence did not end with her pink cardigan and blood quills. Instead, she evolved into one of the most terrifying bureaucrats of Voldemort's regime, cold, methodical, and disturbingly zealous. Unlike many others who served the Dark Lord out of fear, Umbridge aligned with the new order of her own free will. She saw it as an opportunity to impose her values upon the wizarding world, and few suffered more than the Muggle-borns caught in her web. When she returned to the ministry, it was not through force or coercion, but with welcome arms. The internal structure of the ministry was slowly being corrupted from within, and Umbridge's ambition, cruelty, and obsession with blood purity found fertile ground. Her old alliances with pure-blood supremacists, coupled with her previous position as senior undersecretary, gave her swift access to power, but it was her appointment to the Muggle-born Registration Commission that revealed the full scope of her moral dissent. Dolores Jane Umbridge, under the guise of legality and order, became the face of systematic persecution. The commission was supposedly created to ensure the legitimacy of Muggle-born witches and wizards. In truth, it was a farce, a tool designed to strip magical people of their rights and deliver them into the hands of the Death Eaters. Muggle-borns were accused of stealing magic, as if it were a resource to be hoarded by the pure-blood elite. Their birth alone became a crime, and Umbridge was all too eager to be their judge, jury, and executioner. Each interrogation was held in a cold, windowless chamber deep within the ministry, the same courtroom once used during the trials of alleged Death Eaters after the First Wizarding War. Now, irony twisted the scene. It was no longer criminals being tried, but innocent people, children, parents, healers, shopkeepers, all terrified and powerless. Umbridge sat high above them in the judge's seat, always clad in her signature pink. Her soft, simpering tone belied the venom of her words. She'd shuffle parchment, smile sweetly, and condemn lives with a flick of her wand. Perhaps one of the most harrowing examples was the case of Mary Cattermole. A Muggle-born mother of 3, Mary was summoned before the commission on charges of illegally obtaining a wand. The record notes that Umbridge leaned forward during the trial, inspecting Mary's trembling form, and accused her of fabricating her magical identity. In the book Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, Harry, disguised under Polyjuice Potion, observed the trial and noted, Umbridge leaned forward, looking directly into Mary Cattermole's tearful face. "You are lying, filthy Muggle-born," she said with quiet relish. That single line laid bare the cruelty masked by her polished exterior. But Mary's story was not the only one. There were dozens more, perhaps hundreds. Names like Douglas Fletch, a Muggle-born apothecary from Belfast, and Rhea Whitcomb, a Hogwarts graduate working at the Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes, all found themselves dragged from their homes, interrogated, and either imprisoned in Azkaban or handed over to the Snatchers. The files, later recovered after Voldemort's fall, bore Umbridge's delicate, looping handwriting in crimson ink. Unfit to possess magic. Sentence, detainment. What made Umbridge particularly dangerous was not her loyalty to Voldemort. In fact, she never bore the dark mark. She operated in the grey zone, cloaked in bureaucracy and legalese. She did not cast the Cruciatus Curse in front of an audience, but she made sure others did it behind closed doors. Her atrocities were sanitized by official stamps and signatures. That's what made her uniquely terrifying. She didn't need to believe in Voldemort as a messiah. She only needed to believe in her own rightness, her authority, her sense of order. She carried a wand she didn't deserve and wore a locket she had no right to possess. The locket, and one of Voldemort's Horcruxes, came into her possession by accident, but seemed to resonate with her natural malice. While she wore it, her cruelty deepened. Harry noticed the effect, noting in Deathly Hallows there was a nasty, savage satisfaction in her voice that had not been there before. It was as if the dark magic amplified what was already within her: prejudice, self-righteousness, and an unshakable belief in her own superiority. There are rumors, whispered among those who lived through the regime, that Umbridge was responsible for more than just trials. Some say she authorized magical experimentation on prisoners. Others believe she maintained private holding cells where Muggle-borns were kept without food or water until they confessed to stealing magic. These accounts, while not confirmed by official records, have appeared in testimonies given to the Wizengamot after the war. One unnamed Auror described a chamber beneath the ministry, filled with confiscated wands and personal effects, with Umbridge's name etched onto the authorization forms. What is beyond dispute is the psychological damage she inflicted. Survivors recall being forced to write lines with a blood quill, a sadistic practice she developed at Hogwarts and then brought to the ministry. Even as adults, many found themselves seated before her, scratching, "I am not a real witch," into their own skin. And she watched. She watched and smiled. She believed she was cleansing the wizarding world of impurity, and in doing so she unleashed suffering on a scale no one expected from a woman in pink. Her downfall was not marked by a great battle. When the ministry fell back into rightful hands after Voldemort's death, Umbridge attempted to flee. Disguised, she made her way toward the Floo Network control office, hoping to escape to a friendly pure-blood household. But she was caught, wand in hand, trying to incinerate documents from the Muggle-born Commission. These included testimonies, orders for detainment, and personal notes. Among them was a list of children, all underage, flagged for future observation. It was a chilling reminder that Umbridge had long-term plans. She wasn't just persecuting the present, she was shaping the future. Number 16, forging decrees in the name of the ministry. The pink-clad tyrant Dolores Umbridge is remembered by many for her cruel punishments, syrupy voice, and iron-fisted rule over Hogwarts during Harry Potter's 5th year. But what few fans realize, especially those who only watched the films, is that Umbridge didn't just enforce the ministry's will. She pretended to be the ministry. At some point during her terrifying rise to power, she began issuing decrees without any approval from the Ministry of Magic at all. Her pink office in Hogwarts became a place not of administration, but of dictatorship. The smiling cat plates on her walls concealed an ugly truth. Umbridge was committing fraud, one decree at a time. Each proclamation nailed to the Hogwarts notice board bore the words, "By order of the Ministry of Magic." The students and teachers alike believed at first that these were legitimate. But in truth, many of these parchments were entirely fabricated by Umbridge herself. She wasn't simply a messenger of the ministry, she became the ministry in her own mind. No longer content with executing orders, she took it upon herself to create them. The line between authority and ambition blurred dangerously, and no one dared question her. The book, Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, hints at this quiet usurpation. J.K. Rowling writes, Professor Umbridge sat behind her desk, a blank parchment in front of her, and she looked as though she had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. That moment was not simply about discipline, it was about taking control. Umbridge didn't wait for ministry confirmation before unleashing new rules. Her goal was to build a regime where she was the sole authority, and she almost succeeded. Umbridge began subtly. Her first decree, Educational Decree number 22, appointed her as the Hogwarts High Inquisitor. That at least came from the ministry. But soon afterward, the decrees came faster, more intrusive, and more absurd. She banned music, censored literature, dissolved student organizations, and dictated where and when students could walk. She didn't consult anyone in the ministry. She merely pulled out her quill and wrote whatever law suited her mood. One of the most chilling moments in the book reveals the scale of her obsession with control. The hallway outside her office became a corridor of fear. Students walked past the notice board and felt their stomachs drop. Another decree, another restriction, and always the same signature. Dolores Jane Umbridge, High Inquisitor. No second name, no supporting signatures, no evidence of ministry consultation. These weren't ministry approved, they were Umbridge approved. She weaponized bureaucracy. By issuing so many decrees, she created a dense fog of law where no one could tell which rules were real and which ones were her own inventions. The teachers were silenced. Students like Harry, Hermione, and Neville lived under constant threat of punishment for offenses no one had committed until she invented them. It wasn't just authoritarianism, it was forged authoritarianism, cloaked in a pretense of legality. Perhaps the most sinister part of this operation was how Umbridge used these false decrees to isolate students from each other. She banned gatherings of more than 3 students unless she personally approved them. She shut down the Gobstones Club. She outlawed Dumbledore's army. And while the ban on DA may seem like a justified reaction from the Ministry's point of view, the truth is that Umbridge had no permission to do so. The decree banning secret student organizations was never seen in the hands of any official beyond her own. She wrote it, she signed it, she enforced it, alone. Her manipulation extended even to staff evaluations. Umbridge conducted inspections of teachers, during which she made notes and then issued further decrees. These were not recommendations sent back to the Ministry. These were direct commands, like her dismissal of Professor Trelawney and near dismissal of Hagrid. She even tried to force Professor McGonagall into submission, but there was no Ministry presence, no tribunal, no vote, only Umbridge's smirk, her clipboard, and her fabricated authority. The Ministry itself seemed unaware of the full extent of Umbridge's control. Cornelius Fudge, busy with denying Voldemort's return, gave her sweeping power but failed to supervise her. This allowed Umbridge to interpret her role however she wished. She became law, judge, and executioner within the walls of Hogwarts. No oversight, no accountability, and no hesitation. By the time Educational Decree No. 26 appeared, banning teachers from giving students information not strictly related to their subject, Umbridge had fully replaced common sense with paranoia. The Ministry never asked for such a measure. It was a personal vendetta disguised as policy. This decree silenced voices like Professor McGonagall, who attempted to guide students with wisdom beyond textbooks. Umbridge wasn't protecting education, she was destroying it. When Hermione Granger confronted her during one of their classes, the entire room held its breath. But even Hermione, brilliant and fearless, couldn't stop Umbridge. Why? Because legally there was no proof that her decrees were invalid. She had mastered the art of authoritarian illusion. The paper looked official, the seal was there, but the process behind it, approval, review, ministry discussion, was absent. It was a performance of power, nothing more. The students knew something was wrong. Ron Weasley famously muttered, "She's got more rules than Filch's cleaning cupboard." But even that joke masked fear. Everyone felt the change, the cold grip of false governance. Umbridge turned Hogwarts into a microcosm of totalitarian rule, complete with propaganda, surveillance, and fear. Her decrees lined the walls like wartime posters. Obey, stay silent, don't question. In a chilling scene in the book, the Weasley twins, Fred and George, decide to rebel. They set off fireworks in the corridors, not just to disrupt classes, but to disrupt Umbridge's regime. They didn't say it aloud, but their message was clear. This wasn't just about school anymore, it was about tyranny. They refused to be ruled by someone whose laws were not real. Their rebellion was a direct challenge to a forged government. The irony is bitter. Umbridge accused Harry and Dumbledore of creating a secret army to take over the Ministry. Yet she herself became the real usurper, building an unlawful regime from behind a desk. Dumbledore saw it coming. In one line that echoes deeply, he says, "You have been raising questions, Dolores, and answering them yourself." It wasn't just metaphorical. She asked, "What does the Ministry want?" Then she answered, "Exactly what I want." Umbridge's decrees were never about safety. They were about control and isolation. Every parchment she pinned was another thread in her web. By forbidding communication, banning gatherings, and limiting student movement, she ensured no one could organize resistance. She knew that dictatorships thrive when people are afraid to whisper. And at Hogwarts, whispers had become dangerous. When Dumbledore finally disappeared after taking the blame for Dumbledore's army, Umbridge's victory felt total. She had ousted the only real authority. Her decrees, once veiled in imitation, became the new law of the land. Students trembled, teachers obeyed, and still the Ministry remained silent. Whether through ignorance or fear, they allowed her to continue, and so Umbridge's fraud became normalized. This story is not one of overreach, it is one of fraudulent governance under the guise of legitimacy. Umbridge did not need Dementors in the classroom to spread fear. Her weapon was a quill. Her battlefield was the notice board. Her army was made of lies written in ink, sealed with a stolen authority. And no one stopped her, not because she was right, but because she wore the mask of law. In the end, her regime crumbled not through confrontation, but through exposure. When the Centaurs dragged her into the forest, it wasn't just a punishment, it was a poetic consequence. She had ruled like a queen without a crown. The forest, wild and untamed, was a perfect counterpoint to her obsession with control. The magic she couldn't bend became her downfall. But by then her forgeries had already left scars on Hogwarts. Dolores Umbridge will forever be remembered as the woman in pink with a love for kittens and torture. But behind the ribbons and ruffles was a master manipulator of legal illusion. She did not just abuse power, she fabricated it. Every decree she posted without permission was a crime against truth. And the saddest part? It worked. For nearly a year she ruled unopposed. All it took was fear, a lie, and a forged seal. Would Hogwarts have survived if she had stayed longer? We can only wonder. What we do know is this. Umbridge didn't just terrorize students. She corrupted the very idea of governance. And in doing so, she gave us one of the darkest lessons of the wizarding world. Sometimes the greatest evil is not in the unforgivable curses, but in the quiet scratching of a quill, writing laws no one agreed to. Number 17, Posthumous Disgrace of James Potter. There are many reasons why Dolores Umbridge stands apart from every other professor who ever walked the halls of Hogwarts. It's not just the sugar-coated sadism, the pink cardigans, or even the ministry-sanctioned tyranny she enforced. What separates her from the rest is something far darker. Her deliberate psychological warfare, her surgical cruelty. One scene in Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix exemplifies this better than most, yet it was never adapted to the screen. It is a moment when Umbridge attempts not just to punish Harry Potter, but to mutilate the memory of his father James. It happened behind closed doors, as many of her worst offences did. During one of her many detentions with Harry, a word which, under her regime, had come to mean sanctioned torment, Umbridge launched an attack that was chilling not for its physical cruelty, but for its cold brutality of intent. She looked Harry in the eye, smiled with that same twisted smugness she always wore, and spoke words that Harry never expected to hear from an adult, let alone a professor. She spoke of James Potter not as a war hero, not as a member of the Order of the Phoenix, not as a young man who had laid down his life to resist Voldemort. She called him a disgrace, a bully, a typical arrogant troublemaker. And then, with carefully chosen venom, she added, the kind of boy who ought to have been expelled. Hogwarts would have been better off without him. Her words weren't simply meant to belittle. They were calculated to wound. This moment, quietly tucked into the pages of the 5th book, is often overlooked in favour of more overt horrors, the Blood Quill, the Inquisitorial Squad, the Ministry's smear campaign. But this, perhaps more than anything, reveals the true core of Umbridge's malice. She didn't just torment the living, she attempted to desecrate the dead, to strike Harry where he was most vulnerable, in the memory of the father he never knew. Harry had grown up in deprivation, not just physical, but emotional and historical. The Dursleys never spoke of James or Lily. For most of his life, Harry's parents were mysteries to him, shadows glimpsed in photos or remembered by others. James was a legend built out of fragments, the man who defied Voldemort 3 times, who fought beside Sirius Black and Remus Lupin, who gave his life in a futile attempt to protect his wife and son. For Harry, James was never just a father, he was a symbol, a connection to a lost world, a piece of identity that could never be replaced. And Umbridge knew it. She always knew exactly what would hurt the most. And when she saw that Harry clung to the idea of his father, that he held James up as an ideal of bravery, loyalty, and resistance, she set her sights on that target. In her mind, if she could topple that image, if she could poison Harry's memory with just enough doubt, she might finally bring him to heel. To understand the cruelty of this, one must consider the timing. Harry was already under unbearable pressure during his 5th year. Isolated by the ministry's smear campaign, disbelieved by many of his peers, plagued by dreams he didn't understand, and burdened with the prophecy he didn't yet know, he was clinging to the memory of his parents as a lifeline. And when he looked at James, he saw the kind of wizard he wanted, needed, to become. Not perfect, but strong. Protective. Resilient. That's why Umbridge's words were so devastating, because she wasn't just expressing an opinion, she was rewriting history. She was reframing James not as a hero, but as a thug, not as a martyr, but as a nuisance. And she did so from a position of authority, knowing full well the weight her words carried. Her contempt was sharpened by institutional power. She didn't speak as Dolores, she spoke as the High Inquisitor. There is a moment in the book, often skipped in film discussions, when Harry reflects on his father after this encounter. It comes shortly after he sees Snape's memory in the pensive, where James is indeed shown bullying Severus during their school days. Harry is horrified, confused, ashamed, and it is in that vulnerable, shaken state that Umbridge strikes. She sees the cracks forming in Harry's image of his father and wedges herself in like a splinter. She doesn't offer understanding. She doesn't use this as a teaching moment. She doesn't care that Harry is grieving anew for a parent he never truly had the chance to know. She simply twists the knife. Her line, "Perhaps you're more like him than you care to admit," is not a casual remark. It's a calculated attack. She is, in essence, suggesting that Harry's own defiance, his outbursts, his refusal to obey her oppressive rule, are not signs of integrity but inherited arrogance. No other professor at Hogwarts ever stooped to such a level. Not even Snape, who had his own long-standing grudge against James, ever suggested that Harry's father should have been expelled. Even in his most biased moments, Snape's scorn was rooted in personal pain and rivalry, but Umbridge, her malice was institutional. She weaponized the weight of her office against a grieving boy. And the terrifying thing is, she believed she was right. Umbridge genuinely saw herself as a guardian of order, a protector of propriety. To her, people like James, rule-breakers, pranksters, rebels, were the disease, and Harry was the symptom. Her mission, as she saw it, was to purge Hogwarts of this infection. By attacking James's memory, she was laying the groundwork to delegitimize Harry completely. If James was a disgrace, then so was his son. If James should have been expelled, then perhaps Harry deserved the same fate. What makes this even more chilling is the legacy she sought to erase. James wasn't just a student, he was part of the original Order of the Phoenix. He stood against Voldemort when most wizards trembled. He fought for justice, for freedom, and for the very world that Umbridge now claimed to defend. His defiance, the same defiance Harry showed, was not the mark of a delinquent, but of a hero. Even Dumbledore, who was rarely drawn into emotional declarations, spoke of James with deep respect. Sirius, for all his flaws, idolized him. Lupin mourned him not just as a friend, but as the best of them all. And Lily, brilliant, principled, compassionate Lily, chose James. That alone should speak volumes. Yet none of this mattered to Umbridge. In her world, rules were supreme. Compassion was weakness. Resistance was treason. Her attempt to tarnish James Potter's legacy wasn't a passing cruelty. It was part of a larger campaign, a rewriting of Hogwarts history to suit the Ministry's narrative. She couldn't erase the statue of the Potters in Godric's Hollow, but she could plant seeds of doubt in the next generation. She could make students believe that rebellion was selfish, that questioning authority was shameful, and that even the dead could be stripped of their dignity if they didn't fall in line. It's easy to forget how fragile memory is in the wizarding world. Portraits may whisper and ghosts may linger, but truth is not immortal, It must be protected, repeated, upheld. What Umbridge did, in one quiet, cruel moment, was attempt to corrupt that truth, to reach across the veil and smear the reputation of a man who had already paid the ultimate price. And Harry? Harry bore the brunt of it with clenched fists and a burning throat. He didn't answer her, he didn't scream. But something inside him cracked. That night, when he returned to the common room, he sat in silence. He looked at the Marauder's map, at the tiny ink dots representing his father's old friends, and wondered what James would have said if he were alive. He wasn't sure anymore, and that uncertainty, that doubt, was Umbridge's real victory. Yet it's telling that Harry never fully succumbed to her narrative. Though shaken, he kept fighting. Though wounded, he remembered. In the end, it was not Umbridge's story that survived, but Harry's. James may have been imperfect, as all men are, but he was no disgrace. His life, his sacrifice, and the love he left behind were stronger than any bureaucrat's slander. Still, the memory lingers, a moment when the line between psychological abuse and political control blurred into one. A moment when a boy, already battered by loss, was told that even the dead could be stripped for honor. A moment the films never showed, but one that readers can never forget. Number 18. Manipulation of the prophecy. In the labyrinthine politics of the magical world, few figures inspire such universal repulsion as Dolores Jane Umbridge. In Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, her cruelty, her smile that didn't reach her eyes, and her oppressive rule over Hogwarts made her a villain on par with the Death Eaters. But while the films portrayed her as a sadistic bureaucrat installed by the Ministry to control the school, they omitted one of the most insidious facets of her assignment, her quiet, relentless attempt to uncover the truth behind the prophecy concerning Harry Potter and Lord Voldemort. Not because she cared for the safety of the wizarding world, but because she wanted control over the knowledge that could make her indispensable to the Ministry. From the moment Umbridge stepped into Hogwarts as the new Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher, her mission was never limited to mere educational reform. Cornelius Fudge, gripped by paranoia and blinded by fear of Dumbledore's growing influence, saw Harry not as a boy traumatized by Cedric Diggory's death, but as a pawn in a potential rebellion. And Umbridge? She took to this assignment with fanatical zeal. Her saccharine facade cloaked a deeper ambition, to infiltrate the mystery Dumbledore refused to share, the secret at the heart of Harry's importance. She knew there was something more, something everyone else was missing. Throughout the book, Umbridge's methods grow increasingly invasive. At first they masquerade as disciplinary protocol, the detentions, the rules, the decrees, but underneath them all was a sharp attentiveness, a needling presence around Harry, especially after his outbursts about Voldemort's return. She watched his every move. When she handed him the blood quill to carve words into his skin, it wasn't only to punish him, it was a test. How far could she push him before he broke? Would he reveal anything under pressure? The turning point came when she instituted the High Inquisitor position, giving herself unchecked authority. With this new power, Umbridge began orchestrating a psychological campaign. Her interrogations of teachers were showpieces, but with Harry they were personal. She was constantly trying to corner him, to find inconsistencies in his story. She tried to isolate him, banning the Quibbler and mocking Dumbledore's army as dangerous nonsense. But behind every snide remark was a deeper probe. She believed, rightly, that Harry held pieces of something critical. One of her most disturbing moments came not in a classroom, but in her office, pink, perfumed, and smothering. In the book, it's clear that Harry was repeatedly summoned for discipline, but the details often fade into the background of his larger rebellion. In one of these sessions, Umbridge used Veritaserum. Snape himself confirmed she requested it, stating, "You used the last of my stores on Miss Chang, I believe, and I told you I had no more." Harry realizes she'd been trying to drug him for answers. The implications are chilling, a government official drugging a student to extract confidential information. Not about mischief or rules, but about prophecy, death, and war. She didn't know the full prophecy. She didn't need to. What she understood was that Dumbledore and Harry shared a secret that could challenge the Ministry's narrative. And the more she failed to uncover it, the more aggressive she became. Her educational decrees weren't just about control. They were nets, cast wider and wider to catch whispers of truth. She wasn't simply cracking down on dissent. She was hunting the prophecy by strangling Hogwarts with bureaucracy. The book suggests that Umbridge's obsession bordered on madness. When the Weasley twins dropped out in a blaze of rebellion, she didn't see it as teenage revolt. She saw it as Dumbledore's maneuvering. When Dumbledore vanished after taking the blame for Dumbledore's army, she didn't celebrate. She grew more desperate. With Dumbledore gone, she lost the chance to confront him directly, to coerce him into speaking. Harry became her only remaining link. In one moment that didn't make it into the films, she interrogates Harry about his frequent absences and suspicious activity. "You are a liar and a troublemaker, and I shall see you expelled for it, Potter." But there's an undertone of panic. She feared what she didn't understand, and Harry was a living reminder that the Ministry didn't have the full picture. Every time he defied her, she grew more certain that something was being kept from her. It drove her to acts of increasing cruelty, not just for revenge, but in a twisted attempt to pry open the truth. When she brings in Dementors to attack Harry and Dudley in Order of the Phoenix, later confirmed by her own confession, it shows just how far she was willing to go. This wasn't punishment, it was an attempt at silencing. She wanted to discredit Harry, to neutralize the boy who wouldn't bend, who might hold the prophecy the Ministry feared. Even in her attack, she cloaked it in plausible deniability. It was sabotage as policy. Her treatment of Trelawney offers another clue. Sybil Trelawney, despite her erratic nature, was the one who delivered the prophecy in the first place. Umbridge dismissed her not for poor teaching alone, but perhaps to gain closer access to records, testimonies, and possibilities. The book tells us that she allowed Trelawney to remain in the castle only because Dumbledore demanded it. But who knows what records Umbridge scoured while she had access to the tower? She would have searched every drawer, every memory, every anecdote for a clue. Then there was the attempt to enter the Forbidden Forest with Harry and Hermione. In the films, it plays as comic misdirection. In the book, however, there's a haunting sense of her unraveling. She demands to know who Dumbledore is hiding, what secrets are being buried in the woods. "Tell me what he's keeping in there. I want the truth," she shouts. She believes that somewhere in the darkness, the answers lie. The prophecy has become a monster in her mind, an invisible weapon that could tip the scales of power, and she wants it under lock and key. It's important to understand what the prophecy actually was. It was not a weapon. It was not a tool. It was a shadow, a fragment of fate that Voldemort misunderstood, and that Harry was still trying to grasp. But Umbridge, like the rest of the Ministry, thought in terms of control. If the prophecy existed, then someone could possess it, hide it, use it, and if Dumbledore had it, then he had an advantage over Fudge. That could not be allowed. Umbridge's obsession was fueled by the fear that knowledge alone could dethrone the government she served. Her constant surveillance, her use of enchanted quills, her interviews with students, all were part of a web. She wanted students to inform on each other, not just for minor infractions, but for talk about the Order, about Dumbledore, about anything unusual. She built a culture of fear in order to flush out whispers. And when that failed, she resorted to brute force, taking Harry to her office and threatening him with the Cruciatus curse. "You have no business here," she said, trembling with rage. "This is Ministry business." To her, extracting the prophecy from Harry wasn't illegal. It was necessary. Her loyalty to the Ministry overrode all sense of morality. What she didn't understand was that the prophecy could not be taken. It could only be fulfilled. Her misunderstanding of power, believing it resided in domination rather than wisdom, is what doomed her mission. She chased a ghost, and in doing so, she left a trail of real harm. Students traumatized, Trelawney humiliated, Hogwarts poisoned. The films gave us a Dolores Umbridge who was terrifying, yes, but they didn't show the full scope of her role in the larger narrative. She was not just an obstacle, she was a seeker of secrets, a manipulator of truths, a would-be gatekeeper of prophecy. Her failure wasn't due to incompetence, but to her fundamental inability to understand that some truths are not weapons to be wielded, but burdens to be carried. The real tragedy of Umbridge was that she thought herself the heroine of her own story. She believed she was protecting order, ensuring safety, preserving stability. But what she did instead was corrupt every room she entered. Her attempts to extract the prophecy made her as dangerous, in some ways, as those who sought to use it. The difference was that Voldemort knew it was a matter of life and death. Umbridge thought it was about politics. The legacy she left behind wasn't just pain, it was a blueprint for authoritarianism. The idea that knowledge can be controlled, that truth can be beaten out of a child, that loyalty to power is more important than loyalty to justice. She failed to get the prophecy, but she succeeded in proving how easily evil can wear a smile and speak in a sugary voice. In the shadows of the castle, beneath the watchful eyes of portraits and enchantments, Dolores Umbridge waged her own secret war. It was not fought with wands alone, but with fear, intimidation, and manipulation. She tried to rewrite the narrative of the boy who lived, not with lies, but with silence. The silence of threats, of forced compliance, of buried truths. She was a villain, not because she killed, but because she believed control was compassion and silence was order. Her manipulation of the prophecy was more than a subplot. It was a symptom of a larger illness within the wizarding world, a refusal to face truth, a hunger to own it, and it nearly consumed everything. Number 19, intimidation of parent committees. Dolores Umbridge's reign at Hogwarts is remembered by most for her pink cardigans, her sickly smile, and the infamous decree-laden plaques nailed onto every stone wall. The films captured the cruelty she unleashed upon students, the blood quills, the detentions, the silencing of dissent, but they missed something far more insidious, something that festered beyond the castle walls. Dolores Umbridge didn't merely impose tyranny within Hogwarts, she extended her influence into the very homes of students, targeting their parents, their livelihoods, their safety. What the films never revealed was how she suppressed an entire generation of wizarding families by crushing their right to speak. It began subtly, almost invisibly, as all oppressive tactics do. During the early weeks of Umbridge's rule as Hogwarts High Inquisitor, there were whispers among the parents. Witches and wizards from Hogsmeade, Ottery St. Catchpole, and even far off Inverness wrote anxious letters to the school board, requesting clarification on the sudden shift in educational values. The new decrees alarmed them. Children returned home for holidays with fearful eyes and stories that didn't align with the official ministry line. Some wrote directly to Headmistress McGonagall, not yet understanding that power had already been stripped from her office. One such parent was Elspeth Dawlish, mother of third-year Ravenclaw student Matilda Dawlish. Elspeth had always believed in the ministry, had even served for a short time in the Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes. But when her daughter described being punished for asking too many questions, she sent a carefully worded owl addressed to Hogwarts, requesting a meeting with the new Inquisitor. She never received a reply from Umbridge. Instead, 3 days later, an official memo arrived from the Department of Magical Education stating that parents are reminded that internal pedagogical matters fall exclusively under ministry purview. It wasn't signed, but the pink wax seal was unmistakable. Other families reported more frightening consequences. Alaric Fenwick, whose son Gideon was a fifth-year Gryffindor, had travelled to Hogwarts himself after his son returned home with welts from a detention. A quiet man who rarely challenged authority, Alaric appeared before the gates, demanding an audience. He waited for over 5 hours in the cold. Eventually, he was turned away by a squad of ministry-appointed school security. The following week, Alaric was dismissed from his job at the Department of Magical Games and Sports. No official explanation was given. These weren't isolated incidents. A pattern emerged. Parents who voiced concern, even mild dissent, received warnings. Not the loud kind that made headlines, but quiet, bureaucratic ones. Letters marked confidential arrived bearing the emblem of the ministry, advising recipients to reconsider involvement in educational critique. Families like the Shaffics, the Twilfits, even some purebloods known for loyalty to the establishment, were stunned to find their Flu network access limited or their Gringotts accounts flagged for audit. Umbridge had discovered a method more sinister than detention. She learned how to weaponize the ministry's paperwork. She didn't need spells, she had influence. She had the ear of Fudge, she had quills, parchment, and seals, and she wielded them with precision. Her reach expanded, not only silencing parents but creating an aura of such deep fear that many simply stopped asking questions. Some withdrew their children from Hogwarts altogether, only to find that alternative magical education was suddenly under review or prohibited due to regulatory infractions. In a particularly egregious case, the Parkinson family, yes, even the family of Pansy Parkinson Trixor, received a ministry notification that their business license to import wandwood from Scandinavia was suspended. The timing was no coincidence. After Mr. Parkinson had written a letter expressing concern about the excessive punishment of his daughter's peers, their shop in Knockturn Alley was closed for 12 weeks. The message was clear. No one was beyond reach. Umbridge understood power in a way few others did. She understood that fear is more effective when it feels personal. She didn't need the Cruciatus curse. She just needed to ensure that every witch and wizard who dared challenge her would lose something they loved, a job, a privilege, a connection, a piece of their future. It was strategic terror. It was oppression that wore perfume and smiled through kitten portraits. What made her methods so effective was their invisibility. The Daily Prophet didn't report these incidents. Most didn't even reach the Wizarding wireless network. After all, many of the silenced families had once believed in the ministry's order, had supported Fudge's rhetoric against Dumbledore. To speak out now would be to admit their error. Pride did half the work, fear did the rest. Hermione Granger, ever perceptive, noticed these absences. "People are afraid," she remarked in Order of the Phoenix, "afraid of losing their jobs, afraid of what might happen to their families. The ministry's got them all running scared." What she didn't know was just how true those words were. The fear had seeped not only into the halls of Hogwarts, but into every letterbox across magical Britain. A lesser-known but deeply chilling example involved the McDougal family of Aberdeen. Their twin sons, Angus and Fergus, had sent an enchanted howler home, describing an incident where Umbridge forced a class to write lines with blood quills for laughing during History of Magic. Mrs. McDougal, a healer at St. Mungo's, responded by sending a formal complaint to the Board of Governors. Within 2 weeks, she found herself reassigned to the magical pest containment ward, notorious for its grueling hours and high exposure to venomous tentacula. She resigned within the month. Even magical folk with no children began to take notice. Owlpost workers commented on the strange number of censored letters arriving from Hogwarts. One goblin at Gringotts, who asked to remain unnamed, recalled a spike in flag transactions involving known Hogwarts parents. "It was like a shadow tax," he said, "punishment disguised as policy." And what about the Hogwarts governors? What of those appointed to oversee the school's well-being? One by one, they were either dismissed or cowed into submission. Septima Gallipoli, a half-blood witch who served on the board for decades, vanished from public view after challenging Umbridge's right to issue corporal punishment. It was later discovered that her wand had been seized pending review for inappropriate usage. She never returned to public service. Umbridge's tactics were never spontaneous. Every step was premeditated, every letter vetted, every punishment designed to erode the will of her opponents. When Zachariah Smith's aunt, Lavinia Smith, a ministry official herself, attempted to question Umbridge's rise in the educational decree hierarchy, she found her office relocated to a basement corridor next to the magical sewage maintenance department. Not fired, just forgotten, buried, broken. There was no resistance network among the parents. Not really. A few tried to band together. A short-lived group called the Alliance for Magical Youth Rights held 3 meetings in Diagon Alley's backrooms before being infiltrated by a ministry informant. The leader, Benjamin Flume, a cousin of the Honeyduke's owner, was arrested for disruptive enchantment and forced to register as a magical agitator. His business license was suspended. No one dared step forward to replace him. This silence enabled Umbridge to move without scrutiny. It allowed her to pass Educational Decree No. 24, banning all student organizations, and Decree No. 29, granting her discretionary authority over correspondence and visitor permissions. When Harry's letters were intercepted or when students were prevented from seeing their families, there was no public outcry, because the public had been crushed into submission. In the book Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, J.K. Rowling wrote, "The ministry has fallen into the hands of people who want to control everything, including what you think." It was not hyperbole. Dolores Umbridge didn't need dark magic to do dark things. She used bureaucracy, she used silence, she used fear. Years later, during the post-war tribunals, much was made of Umbridge's detentions, her lies, her role in persecuting Muggle-borns. But few spoke of the months she ruled Hogwarts before the rise of Voldemort, months during which she single-handedly warped the entire educational and familial structure of the British wizarding world. Her cruelty wasn't loud, it was quiet and methodical. The tragedy of her influence was not only the damage she inflicted, but the fact that so few fought back, not because they didn't care, but because they were paralyzed. She'd constructed a system in which resistance became riskier than survival. She blurred the lines between ministry policy and personal vendetta until there was no clear line at all. The films chose to focus on the spectacle, the fireworks in the hallways, the twins' rebellion, the Centaur stampede. And those moments mattered. But the true horror of Umbridge's tenure wasn't the dramatics, it was the dread, the cold hand of government letters, the unseen consequences of one's words, the silence that followed every attempt at protest. Dolores Umbridge understood something that even Voldemort did not. Power doesn't always require fear of death. Sometimes all it takes is fear of inconvenience, fear of shame, fear of being alone. And with that she conquered not just a school, but a country. Number 20. Collection of forbidden artifacts. Of all the characters who walked the hallowed halls of Hogwarts, few evoked such deep discomfort as Dolores Jane Umbridge. Her pastel pink cardigans and sugar-sweet demeanor masked something far darker than mere ambition or cruelty. What the films only briefly hinted at, but the books quietly laid the foundation for, was the eerie undercurrent of magical manipulation that seemed to radiate from her very presence. Yet there was one particular layer of her secret life that remained almost completely hidden from casual readers and wholly absent from the cinematic adaptations, her private collection of forbidden magical artifacts. Tucked away behind lace curtains and porcelain kitten plates, Umbridge maintained a hidden cabinet in her office, one that few students ever noticed and no staff dared to question. The cabinet itself was unassuming, carved from dark oak with a brass handle shaped like a serpent devouring its own tail. But those sensitive to magic, like Harry Potter, often felt a creeping sensation near it, as if something inside was watching them. Hermione once whispered that it was a charm meant to repel curiosity, a subtle twist on the Confundus spell, paired with a ward that instilled unease in those who lingered too close. During his many detentions under Umbridge's regime, Harry began to notice patterns, barely audible sounds that drifted through the room when her back was turned. Whispers, soft rattling, even the faint buzz of enchantment. At first, he assumed it was his exhaustion or a product of nerves, but once, as he sat carving the words "I must not tell lies" into his hand, the hair on his arms stood on end as a high-pitched chime rang from the cabinet, sharp, slicing, then gone. It left him dizzy, and for the rest of the evening he felt unusually compliant, as though his mind had been gently tugged toward submission. These incidents, though fleeting, were enough for Hermione to begin investigating. In Order of the Phoenix, she remarks that Umbridge's brand of magic feels old, cold, and unnatural, a chilling description that suggests something more than textbook spellwork. When asked in later years, Hermione would never confirm what she suspected, only that there was a reason no one lingered in her office. It was Professor McGonagall, after the fall of Voldemort, who eventually confessed to Aurors that she had long harboured suspicions about Umbridge's activities. According to an anonymous source in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, McGonagall described a moment when she entered the Defense Against the Dark Arts office unexpectedly and caught sight of a black velvet pouch on Umbridge's desk, quickly hidden when their eyes met. McGonagall later recognized the symbols embroidered on the pouch as those used in the Department of Mysteries to mark unclassified artifacts under observation. One such item, rumored to have been recovered from the department's Hall of Prophecy, was a silvery orb known as the Morning Eye. Said to pulse when someone near it harbored rebellious thoughts, the orb had once belonged to a seer who went mad after keeping it in her bedroom for months. According to records, it was deemed dangerous for psychological proximity and was placed in containment. That the artifact ever left the department is a scandal yet unresolved. But there are whispers that Umbridge, during her brief tenure as senior undersecretary to the minister, had access to restricted storage. Those who studied her time at Hogwarts post-war found evidence in the form of faint, residual enchantments left behind in the walls of her former office. Magical residue, when tested, showed traces of domination spells and subtle panic-inducing wards. Magical historian Edgar Bones published a short paper titled The Office of Oppression, in which he wrote, "It is rare to find manipulation magic deployed within an educational setting with such surgical precision. The design was not to teach, but to break." Her obsession with order and compliance didn't stop with rules and punishments. It extended into a deeper, more arcane form of domination. Among the artifacts she supposedly kept was a mirror framed in pale bone, often mistaken for a decorative piece. But Fred and George Weasley, during one of their surveillance missions for the DA, overheard Filch grumbling about having to carry it down from the North Tower with strict orders not to look into it. The mirror, if one believes the department's logs, was known as the Mirror of Lucidity. Instead of showing reflections, it altered them, subtly adjusting posture, expression, and aura to what the viewer most feared becoming. It is no wonder that so many students reported feelings of despair and helplessness around Umbridge, particularly in her office. Luna Lovegood once described the room as having something heavy in the air, like invisible fog. Though Luna was often dismissed, it's notable that her natural sensitivity to magical energy was unmatched among her peers. Years later, she would write that she believed Umbridge kept a suppressor stone, a grey-black mineral used by dark practitioners to dampen nearby magical resistance. Indeed, several of the artifacts recovered from the office after the Battle of Hogwarts were unregistered magical items. None were deemed illegal by classification, but all bore signatures of enchantments now considered unethical. Among them was a cracked wand box, holding several disassembled wand cores, troll hair, dragon heartstring, and unicorn tail, arranged not for wand-making, but for rituals. Though the exact spellwork could not be deciphered, specialists agreed it bore resemblance to ritualistic binding spells used in the control of magical creatures. Even her infamous quill, used to scar the hands of students, may not have been ordinary magical punishment. It was never listed among standard ministry issue, and its enchantment to draw blood without ink is a rare and sophisticated form of blood-binding magic. According to Ollivander's private correspondence with the Wizengamot, the quill in question is not of my making, and I do not recognize its enchantment as any I would condone. Some believe that Umbridge's use of these items was not purely for control, but for experimentation. During her time at Hogwarts, there were 6 reported cases of memory fog among first-year students, all of whom had interacted with her office in some capacity. One even claimed that he couldn't remember why he had gone in to speak with her. This kind of subtle memory tampering without the use of obliviate suggests an object capable of draining mental clarity, possibly a variation of a forget-me charm embedded into a talisman or room ward. Her cat plates, seemingly innocent, also played a role. A former ministry clerk later testified that Umbridge had purchased them not from a regular shop, but from an old woman named Greta Binks, a known charm weaver specializing in memory echo charms. The plates weren't just decorative, they were enchanted to absorb and replay minor sounds and phrases. One investigator theorized they could be used to build psychological pressure by looping faint whispers back into the air, creating a sense of being watched or judged. There was also the matter of her tea. Multiple students reported feeling odd after accepting tea from her during disciplinary discussions. One student described feeling too calm, like I forgot to care. It was never proven, but rumors suggest she may have used drops of diluted draught of peace laced with compliance charms. The beverage, if altered with a mild imperious infusion, could weaken resistance without ever tripping traditional spell detection. And what of the black ring she always wore? It was never removed, not even when she wrote or served detention. Some said it held a sliver of obscurus collected from a cursed child during her years investigating underage magic use. While this seems improbable, several magical theorists, including Bathilda Bagshot before her death, speculated that rings of suppression were an old practice among those who wanted to restrain or influence magical potential in others. In the end, the most chilling artifact may have been her own creation, a registry book of behavioral infractions which enchanted itself with the emotional residue of those written inside it. Each name, once written, would form a sympathetic connection with Umbridge, allowing her to feel whenever the student was disobedient, anxious, or angry. Some pages, recovered later, had grown hot to the touch, alive with echoes of the student's emotional states like cursed parchment. It is easy to see Umbridge as a bureaucratic villain, fussy, cruel, and self-important. But the truth, layered in whispers and suppressed reports, is far darker. She wasn't just enforcing the law, she was experimenting with the boundaries of obedience, fear, and magical influence. Her office, decorated with kittens and doilies, was not a place of order, but a quiet chamber of psychological warfare. While Voldemort sought to dominate through terror and power, Umbridge used the subtle arts of magical manipulation to mold minds and suppress dissent. Her artifacts were not weapons in the traditional sense, but instruments of control carefully selected to leave no mark, no trace, only compliance. And though the films omitted this aspect of her darkness, those who passed through her pink-walled prison will always remember the weight of her presence and the silent, forbidden magic humming just out of sight. Number 21, threatening to expel Hermione. Of all the figures to darken the halls of Hogwarts, Dolores Jane Umbridge remains one of the most chilling. Her pink cardigans and sweet smiles masked a calculated cruelty, a hunger for control that was often more insidious than the open malice of Lord Voldemort. While the films portrayed her as vindictive and petty, they failed to fully reveal the depth of her oppressive tactics. One of the most unsettling episodes, entirely omitted from the screen, was her attempt to silence, humiliate, and ultimately expel Hermione Granger, the brightest witch of her age. What the films brushed aside as sharp exchanges between teacher and student was in truth a slow-burning psychological battle, a war of intellect, power, and prejudice. Hermione was not just intelligent, she was fiercely principled. She questioned authority when it faltered injustice, and Dolores Umbridge found that intolerable. To her, Hermione's Muggle-born heritage combined with her unwavering defiance was a threat to everything the Ministry, in its most authoritarian moments, tried to enforce. Umbridge saw Hermione as a stain on her vision of order, too clever, too moral, and worst of all, too outspoken. In the book Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, J.K. Rowling subtly but unmistakably weaves the slow rise of this tension, culminating in a sinister attempt by Umbridge to break Hermione through intimidation and isolation. The films skipped entirely over a critical moment that occurred after Hermione led the charge in organizing Dumbledore's army. When the group was discovered and Dumbledore took the fall, Umbridge, now head mistress, tightened her grip over the school. But what went unspoken in the films was how she began targeting Hermione in the days that followed, not merely as a student, but as a political enemy. According to Rowling's text, Umbridge summoned Hermione to her office more than once, not for punishment, but for pressure. "You seem to have a very high opinion of yourself, Miss Granger," she told her with a saccharine tone that barely masked its threat. These sessions were designed not just to intimidate, but to create a sense of surveillance, of constant judgment. At one point, Umbridge laid her wand gently on the desk between them and spoke words that Hermione would never forget. "You're kind," she said, "ought to be more grateful for the opportunities you've been given. It would be a shame if your attitude made those opportunities disappear." It wasn't just a veiled insult, it was a direct threat, a warning that her blood status paired with her rebellion could be used against her in ways she wouldn't see coming. This moment, raw and bristling with prejudice, was one of the most honest reflections of the systemic bias that Umbridge embodied. What made it more horrifying was how Umbridge operated through institutional power. She didn't shout. She didn't punish Hermione in front of others. She operated through records, rules, and whispered conversations. She tried to build a paper trail that painted Hermione as disruptive, dangerous, unstable. Filch was ordered to keep notes. Professor Snape, though far from fond of Hermione, refused to play along, noting once that her academic record was impeccable. But others, like Alecto Carrow, later known for her role in the following year, would have eagerly joined the effort had they already been at Hogwarts. Hermione, though young, understood perfectly what Umbridge was doing. She became careful, but never silent. She learned to answer questions with questions, to turn Umbridge's legalistic tone back on her. "According to which decree, Madam Umbridge?" she once asked, forcing the woman to stumble through the very rules she'd authored. This wasn't defiance for its own sake. It was survival. It was Hermione weaponizing the very system that sought to crush her. The ultimate escalation came when Umbridge discovered that Hermione was secretly continuing Dumbledore's army even after its disbandment. While Harry and others met in secret, Hermione organized research, drafted magical exercises, and sent encoded messages. When Umbridge's Inquisitorial squad intercepted a note written in enchanted ink, the handwriting led straight back to Hermione. It was then that Umbridge ordered what she called a pre-expulsion review. No such procedure had existed before. She invented it on the spot. She summoned Professor McGonagall, who stood beside Hermione like a shield. The review was scheduled in the Great Hall, a public spectacle intended to humiliate. Hermione stood in the centre, head held high, as Umbridge read from a scroll littered with invented infractions: subversive activity, unauthorized academic collaboration, distribution of unapproved magical content. When Hermione objected, Umbridge declared her comments further evidence of contempt for authority. But what saved Hermione was not magic, it was strategy. Before the review, she had secretly alerted Kingsley Shacklebolt at the Ministry, disguising her message within a book on magical law. Kingsley, then operating as a double agent, quietly ensured that Amelia Bones, head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, reviewed the matter. Bones, known for her sense of fairness, declared the charges procedurally flawed and the accusations an abuse of power. The review was dissolved. Umbridge was humiliated, but not silenced. The films reduce all of this to little more than sharp looks and snide remarks. They miss the terror in Hermione's eyes when she first realized that her future could be taken from her, not for breaking rules, but for being herself. They leave out the fear that any student with Muggle-born heritage might have felt when watching a peer nearly expelled not for what she did, but for who she was. They erase the strength it took for Hermione to walk back into class the next day and raise her hand like nothing had happened. J.K. Rowling never needed to make Hermione a hero through spells or duels. She made her a hero by forcing her to navigate a system that wanted her silent and watching her refuse. When Umbridge could not expel her, she tried to outsmart her. But Hermione responded by mastering every spell, every rule, and every loophole. She turned the Ministry's tools against itself and emerged not only unbroken, but stronger. That complexity, that psychological warfare, was too rich for film adaptation, but it lives in the pages for those who look closely. One especially chilling moment came when Hermione discovered that Umbridge had begun searching through student ancestry records. Hermione had known this was possible, but not that it would be used as a weapon. She remembered the words Umbridge once whispered in her office. "Blood will tell, Miss Granger." It wasn't about education. It was about control, about re-establishing a hierarchy that had no place in the modern wizarding world. And in that hierarchy, Hermione was supposed to remain quiet, grateful, invisible. Even Professor Flitwick, one of Hermione's favourite teachers, began to pull her aside after class. He didn't say it outright, but his eyes held concern. He urged her to focus on her NEWT and reminded her that some battles are best postponed. But Hermione could not postpone who she was. She continued to help other students in secret. Luna Lovegood later recalled how Hermione would stay up late in the library, teaching spells to second years who were afraid to ask in class. She became a silent leader of a silent resistance. The night before the review, Hermione sat alone in the common room, surrounded by law books. Harry offered to sit with her, but she shook her head. "This is something I have to win on paper," she said. It wasn't about wand work. It was about proving, once and for all, that the system didn't own her, that her place in Hogwarts wasn't conditional on silence, that being a Muggle-born was not a weakness, but a strength, because it gave her the perspective to see the system's flaws and the courage to fight them. Ron, often the first to leap to her defense, struggled with the idea that Hermione was being targeted, not for any mistake, but for existing outside Umbridge's warped ideal. He offered to go to Dumbledore, but Hermione refused. "She wants us to act out," she told him. "She wants to justify the fear." It was one of Hermione's greatest moments of restraint, and the clearest sign of her maturity. She knew that the war wasn't just waged in the open, it was fought in whispers, in glances, in accusations. The fallout from the failed review was immense. While Umbridge continued to reign with an iron wand, her power waned. Students began to resist more openly. The Weasley twins' rebellion followed weeks later, but it was Hermione's quiet victory that first cracked the facade. Even Peeves, who rarely cared for anyone's fate, gave a rare salute when Hermione passed by. He had heard the story, as all ghosts and portraits do, and for once found a human worth respecting. The books offer so much more than the films when it comes to showing Hermione's bravery, not just in battle, but in conviction. Umbridge didn't need to cast a Cruciatus curse to torture. She used silence, paperwork, suspicion. She threatened expulsion not as punishment, but as a warning to others. Hermione could have stepped back. She could have chosen safety, but she didn't. She chose truth. Years later, when Hermione became Minister for Magic, few remembered the pre-expulsion review. But those who had been there, those who had seen her stand tall in that cold stone hall, knew the truth. That before she rewrote laws, before she changed the ministry, she fought her first battle in a pink-carpeted office with floral teacups and a quill that carved scars. And she won. That story, absent from the films, is not just a tale of cruelty, but of resistance. It is a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous villains do not shout, and sometimes the bravest heroes raise their hands when the world tells them to lower their heads. Number 22, Contempt for house-elves. There is a moment, barely noticed by many readers and utterly erased in the cinematic adaptation, where Dolores Umbridge reveals something even more sinister than her obsession with rules and punishment. It was not merely her sadistic fondness for detentions or her ruthless enforcement of authority. It was not her saccharine smile that masked a poisonous heart. No, it was something quieter, more chilling, her utter contempt for creatures she considered beneath her, most notably house-elves. While the films showed her tyranny over students, they never revealed how deeply her ideology ran. In the books, however, her disdain for house-elves and her open rejection of their rights stands as a testament to the dark underpinnings of her character. In Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, the Hogwarts kitchens become a place of quiet resistance. Hermione Granger, in her relentless belief in justice, found purpose in SPEW, the Society for the Promotion of Elfish Welfare. She alone saw the invisible labour, the unnoticed suffering, and the blind eye turned by the wizarding community. Most of her peers dismissed her efforts as naive. Ron mocked her. Harry ignored it. But Dolores Umbridge, she didn't mock it, she loathed it. In her view, house-elves weren't workers, they weren't beings. They were tools, servile extensions of wizarding households, meant to obey without question or dignity. During a staff meeting, briefly referenced in the book but never dramatized in the films, Umbridge reportedly laughed at the notion that house-elves deserved rights. She called Hermione's campaign a ridiculous waste of parchment and ink, and added a phrase that left even Professors Sprout and Flitwick shifting uncomfortably in their seats. A house-elf is happiest when it knows its master and knows its broom. That one line, dripping with cruelty and classism, encapsulated her belief system. To her, happiness was submission, purpose was servitude, and free will was nothing more than a nuisance when it came from those she deemed lesser. This attitude, while rarely discussed in depth, was part of a much broader and darker ideology. Umbridge's world was one of strict hierarchies where blood purity, status, and control determined a creature's worth. She may not have worn a Death Eater's mask, but her values often mirrored theirs. Unlike Voldemort, who ruled by fear and domination, Umbridge believed in a more insidious control, a bureaucratic, normalized version of subjugation. Her contempt for house-elves was not emotional. It was administrative. She saw their suffering not as tragedy, but as efficiency. When Hermione placed knitted hats and socks around the Gryffindor common room in hopes that house-elves would find them and free themselves, she found that the elves stopped coming to clean. Dobby, the only one who dared to take a hat, described how the others found the notion of freedom terrifying. But the terror came not only from change, it came from shame. Fear instilled over centuries, reinforced by witches like Umbridge, who saw dignity as dangerous. And while students like Ron joked about it, Umbridge would have punished it. According to one scene recounted in the Order of the Phoenix, during a hallway confrontation near the kitchens, Umbridge noticed Hermione carrying a basket of knitting. When asked what it was for, Hermione hesitated, mentioning SPEW. Umbridge's face twisted, not with confusion, but with something darker, controlled fury. "You waste your time," she had said coldly before marching off. Later that week, Hermione's SPEW notice board mysteriously disappeared from the Gryffindor common room. No one ever proved it, but the suspicion pointed to one person. This was Umbridge's way: erasure, quiet control, censorship without trace. Hogwarts, under Umbridge's rule, became a microcosm of a greater problem: how easily a society turns its eyes away from injustice when it doesn't scream loudly enough. House-elves, hidden in the kitchens, never cried out. They didn't rebel, they didn't demand, and so people like Umbridge could pretend their suffering didn't exist. Worse, she could convince others that it wasn't even suffering at all. "They like it," she once told Fudge during a ministry briefing, according to an account by Arthur Weasley. "They're made for it. It gives them structure." Structure, in Umbridge's mind, was synonymous with control, and control was sacred. When Dobby began working at Hogwarts, paid and free, it was an affront to Umbridge's beliefs. Though she had no jurisdiction over the kitchens, she reportedly spoke out in the ministry against rogue elves being paid for chores. Her ministry memos, Arthur Weasley claimed, had phrases like the erosion of traditional wizarding customs and the danger of elevating non-wizarding species beyond their appropriate station. These weren't outbursts, they were policies in the making. She wanted laws to bind, to define, and to limit. Freedom, in any form, was a threat. Ironically, while Umbridge championed control and order, she operated in darkness. She never visited the kitchens, she never spoke to a house-elf. She spoke about them, around them, over them, but never to them. It wasn't hatred, it was worse: indifference, Hatred is passionate, indifference is institutional. She did not see them as creatures worth punishing because she did not see them at all. They were broomsticks that talked. That's how she framed them. They were the echo of a command, the flicker of a cleaning spell, and nothing more. One day, when Winky, the house-elf, still recovering from her disgrace at the Quidditch World Cup, was seen sobbing in the kitchens, it was because Umbridge had called her damaged goods in passing. Winky, who once served proudly under the Crouch family, took pride in service. But Umbridge did not see her as loyal. She saw her as broken, defective. Kreacher, the Black family's house-elf, even found Umbridge agreeable because she reminded him of his former masters. A proper witch, he called her once, in a rare moment of clarity. That alone speaks volumes. In the bowels of the Ministry, in the Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures, Umbridge once lobbied to classify house-elves not as beings, but as possessions. The motion never passed, thanks largely to Ragnarok the Goblin and a reluctant Centaur delegation, but the fact that it was considered at all remains a stain. She believed the hierarchy must be absolute, not symbolic. She didn't want the illusion of superiority. She wanted it legalized, reinforced, and punishable. Her position wasn't without precedent. Wizards like Abraxas Malfoy and Harfang Longbottom once held similar views. But Umbridge brought a uniquely bureaucratic venom. She didn't bark her opinions, she inked them into margins. She filed reports, submitted drafts, wrote lengthy concerns about non-human interference in magical institutions. Her war against house-elves wasn't declared, it was documented. That's why it was so dangerous. It was quiet, it was official. When Griphook once overheard her refer to goblins as feral account keepers, he nearly drew his blade. But even then he admitted she was clever. She never said these things in public. She didn't rant like Bellatrix. She smiled, she pinned bows on cats and made tea, but her words sliced deeper than curses. In private, she laughed at Dobby's clothes. Who would want to look like that? She had asked, not knowing Harry was nearby. He never forgot it. Filch, loyal to Umbridge and obsessed with punishing students, mirrored her disdain. He once asked if he could assign detentions to elves who shirked their duties. Umbridge had laughed and replied, "They know better." To her, they were part of the castle, like torches or staircases. And like torches, if they flickered, they needed to be replaced, not heard. Even Hagrid, who often stood apart from ministry affairs, once remarked that Umbridge talked about elves like they were vermin. He tried to keep his head down, but in a conversation with Professor McGonagall, overheard by a student, he mentioned how Umbridge had asked whether house-elves in the Forbidden Forest would be a sanitation issue. To her, even the location of a creature dictated its worth. The irony was bitter. While fighting Voldemort in secret, the Order of the Phoenix welcomed creatures of all kinds. Lupin, part werewolf, Firenze, a centaur, Kreacher even, found redemption. But Umbridge, safe in her pink office with lace doilies, fought a different war. She fought against equality, not with spells but with rules, not with violence but with ink, not for power but for obedience. In her world, elves were silent. That was the goal. When Hogwarts finally expelled her influence, when the portraits sighed in relief and the students reclaimed their school, no one noticed the house-elves. But they noticed. Dobby polished the floors with new vigour. Winky cried less. Even the shyest elf smiled when Hermione passed. Umbridge was gone. And though no statue was erected, no ceremony held, the castle itself breathed easier. Years later, Hermione Granger, then working in the Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures, found a dusty file in a cabinet labelled Subhuman Affairs. Inside, she found Umbridge's original draft proposal to strip house-elves of all protection under magical law. At the bottom of the parchment was a note in Umbridge's perfect cursive, "Freedom is a dangerous illusion for those unequipped to wield it." Hermione closed the file, hands trembling. She knew at last the depth of the rot, and so, while the films gave us a villain in pink who loved control and hated children, the books gave us something deeper. a portrait of a woman who believed in order over justice, submission over selfhood, and silence over struggle. Dolores Umbridge's greatest crime wasn't the detentions, the torture, or even the betrayal of Dumbledore's army. It was the quiet, vicious belief that some lives simply didn't matter, and that is a darkness even Voldemort never bothered to conceal. Number 23. Manipulation of magical creatures. Of all the characters who left a mark on Hogwarts during the Second Wizarding War, few inspired such visceral loathing as Dolores Jane Umbridge. Her saccharine smile, rigid posture, and fondness for decorative plates featuring kittens masked a soul so steeped in cruelty, many considered her among the most detestable figures in the Ministry of Magic's history. But while the films portrayed her tyranny over students and her insidious role in torturing Harry Potter and his allies, they overlooked one of her darkest and most disturbing actions: the manipulation and mistreatment of magical creatures for personal gain. During her tenure as Defense Against the Dark Arts professor in Harry's 5th year, Umbridge made it a point to replace practical instruction with dry, repetitive theory. The students, she declared, were far too undisciplined to be trusted with dangerous spells. Yet in a rare and hushed incident mentioned only briefly in the pages of Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, Umbridge went against her own decree. Desperate to prove her competence to both her superiors at the Ministry and the skeptical Hogwarts staff, she secretly arranged for the delivery of a subjugated mountain troll to the school grounds, one that was to be used as a prop in her demonstration of Ministry-approved defensive measures. The incident never reached the public eye in full. It remained buried beneath the more conspicuous horrors of her rule: blood quills, educational decrees, and student interrogations. However, traces of this grotesque scheme can be found in a single, easily overlooked passage in the book, when Hagrid returns and mutters to Professor McGonagall about some poor creature they had no business dragging here in the first place. Although unnamed, it was later confirmed by Hogwarts staff that a troll had indeed been brought to the castle under Umbridge's direct orders. The rationale behind this act was as twisted as it was senseless. Umbridge, according to a private note found in the confiscated files of the Inquisitorial squad, had hoped to recreate a staged attack that she would publicly foil, thereby reinforcing the narrative that under her guidance students were protected and safe. She intended to stage this attack in front of a carefully selected group of observers, including ministry inspectors and parent volunteers from the Hogwarts Board of Governors. To control the troll, she had procured an advanced magical binding collar, enchanted at the Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures. The artifact, banned in many magical communities for its brutal properties, delivered searing pain to the creature at even the slightest hint of disobedience. Trolls, though dull-witted, are not entirely immune to fear, and this one, reportedly a younger and weaker variant of the mountain kind, was said to have been trembling in the lower dungeons of Hogwarts for days prior to its scheduled appearance. Magical creatures, particularly those categorized by the Ministry, are not to be summoned lightly, especially not into the presence of children. Yet Umbridge operated without concern for rules or ethics. Her obsession with authority made her blind to the cruelty of her own actions. She believed the end justified the means, even if those means left a magical being broken or dead. The troll never appeared in any demonstration. Days after its arrival, it vanished. Officially, Umbridge claimed it had been recalled by the Ministry due to improper paperwork. But multiple members of the Hogwarts house-elves whispered otherwise. Winky, still living in the kitchens at the time, was overheard sobbing to herself that she had seen the poor thing limping, covered in marks. No creature should be treated that way. Dobby, who had a deep compassion for all magical beings, tried to investigate further but was allegedly warned off by Argus Filch, who claimed he had explicit instructions from the High Inquisitor herself. According to a private testimony given years later by a former Inquisitorial squad member, Vincent Crabbe, the troll had gone berserk one night in its dungeon cell, either from mistreatment or trauma. It had lashed out and injured 2 guards. What followed was never recorded, but there was a smell of blood in the dungeons for days afterward. Some believe the creature was killed by Umbridge's orders and quietly disposed of in the Forbidden Forest with help from a few loyal students and a complicit caretaker. Others say it was transported back to the Ministry in a state of collapse, its body barely functioning, its eyes dimmed by pain and confusion. Either way, the troll never surfaced again in any known records of the Department of Magical Creatures. For all intents and purposes, it had vanished into the bureaucratic void. What drove Umbridge to such depths of depravity was not curiosity or necessity, it was image. Her deep-rooted insecurities, masked by authority and obsession with order, compelled her to craft illusions of strength. Manipulating magical beings in her mind was no different than commanding students or rewriting rules. She viewed all beings, human or otherwise, as chess pieces in her campaign to become the most trusted figure in magical Britain. The hypocrisy is striking. Throughout her tenure, Umbridge professed to be a steward of safety, invoking ministry protocol to shut down any instruction she deemed unsafe. She castigated Hagrid's lessons on Thestrals, dismissed Centaurs as savages, and prohibited students from practicing defensive spells. Yet she willingly summoned a highly dangerous creature into Hogwarts for a theatrical ruse. This contradiction reveals the hollowness of her principles and the depth of her thirst for validation. It's also worth noting the context of this event within the broader pattern of Umbridge's attitude toward magical beings. Her disdain for part humans, centaurs, werewolves, and even giants was overt. She referred to them in derogatory terms and pushed for their restriction or exile. In Order of the Phoenix, her revulsion for Hagrid's heritage is evident. Half-breeds, she calls them with icy detachment. Her inability to see magical beings as anything but tools or threats allowed her to justify actions that others found unthinkable. The abuse of the troll may have been a one-time event, but it stands as a symbol of how Umbridge weaponized vulnerability. She chose a creature too weak to resist, too simple to understand, and too isolated to be defended. In doing so, she mirrored the psychological abuse she inflicted on students, stripping them of agency, silencing their voices, and using them to bolster her own fragile sense of control. The true tragedy of the incident lies not in its secrecy but in its silence. No disciplinary action was taken, no report was filed. Dumbledore, who was away during parts of the incident and already under siege politically, was limited in what he could do. By the time he returned full-time to Hogwarts, the troll was gone, and the trail had grown cold. Years later, the files recovered from the Department of Magical Law Enforcement during Kingsley Shacklebolt's reformation of the Ministry would include a vague note referencing unauthorized transport of Class C magical beings to educational institutions. Though names were redacted, investigators privately confirmed that the note referred to Umbridge's troll. Even in her eventual trial for crimes committed during her tenure at the Muggle-born Registration Commission, the matter of the troll was never brought forward. It was simply too obscure, too buried beneath the mountain of other atrocities. In the grand scheme of things, compared to the persecution of innocent witches and wizards, it may have seemed minor. But for those who care about the ethical treatment of magical creatures, it was yet another stain on Umbridge's record. Umbridge never saw herself as a villain. She believed her own rhetoric that she was preserving order, discipline, and tradition. But her version of order was built on domination, and her sense of tradition was nothing more than an excuse to cling to control. Her manipulation of magical creatures revealed that her cruelty knew no limits, not of species, nor status, nor scale. This episode also underscores a deeper theme within the wizarding world: the ease with which those in power can erase the suffering of the voiceless. Magical creatures, like house-elves, centaurs, and trolls, often exist on the margins of wizarding society. Their pain, their experiences, their agency are treated as afterthoughts. Umbridge exploited this dynamic with chilling efficiency, knowing that no one would question the fate of a troll. In the aftermath of the war, Hermione Granger would go on to lead numerous initiatives within the department for the regulation and control of magical creatures. It is believed that she once referenced a notorious incident at Hogwarts involving a bound troll and an unpunished official, though she never named names. Whether she intended to pursue justice or simply raise awareness, her efforts contributed to a growing consciousness about magical creature rights. Ultimately, the forgotten troll of Hogwarts stands as a haunting metaphor. It represents all those silenced under Umbridge's rule, the creatures, the students, even the truth itself. Its story, tucked between lines of broader battles, serves as a reminder that true darkness often hides behind the softest smiles, and that evil does not always announce itself with a wand raised high, but sometimes with a clipboard, a pink cardigan, and a polite cough before a decree. And while the films captured much of Umbridge's wickedness, they missed this quiet, cruel corner of her reign, a place where silence screamed louder than words and where the victim was too forgotten to ever be avenged. Number 24. The Book of Informants. When Dolores Umbridge rose to power as Hogwarts High Inquisitor, the castle itself seemed to shudder. Her reign was not simply one of harsh rules and pink cardigans, it was a meticulously constructed regime of fear. While the films showed her cruel punishments, her sugary venom, and her iron-fisted control over every corridor, they omitted one of the most disturbing instruments of her tyranny, the Book of Informers. This book was not displayed publicly, nor was it mentioned in her educational decrees. It was hidden behind layers of pretense and bureaucratic language, referred to in her official communications as the anonymous student oversight log. But to those who felt its touch, it was known simply as the book, a powerful magical artifact that allowed any student to write down a name and an accusation. The handwriting would vanish, absorbed into the parchment, leaving no trace of the informant's identity. To the outside world it looked like an empty book, but within its enchanted bindings it catalogued fear, suspicion, and betrayal. It was introduced during the winter term of Umbridge's reign, shortly after the incident where Fred and George Weasley transformed a corridor into a swamp. To her, that event was not just a prank, it was rebellion, an act of resistance that threatened the very foundation of her control. She needed a way to root out the ringleaders before they could act. And so she created the book. Its presence was never announced during breakfast in the Great Hall, nor pinned to a bulletin board. Instead, it was whispered into the ears of select students, those already predisposed to obedience or worse, eager to earn Umbridge's favour. Slytherins were the first to use it, but not exclusively. Even Ravenclaws and Hufflepuffs in moments of fear or resentment turned to it. And soon it grew, an invisible cancer beneath the surface of the school's ancient stones. Neville Longbottom was among the first victims. His crime? Whispering with Ginny Weasley outside the herbology greenhouse after curfew. "Suspicious behaviour in restricted hours," the entry read. It was enough to land him in Umbridge's office, where she smiled that sickly, sweet smile, and asked questions he couldn't quite answer. Why had he whispered? What were they talking about? Did he have unauthorized reading material? Because Umbridge's book didn't simply log names and actions, it flagged patterns. If a student's name appeared more than once, even on unrelated accusations, it marked them as potentially subversive. Neville's name appeared 6 times in a single week. He would later say that it felt like drowning without water, like being pulled into a pit he never stepped near. The accusations were rarely verified. Truth was irrelevant. Suspicion was enough. A whispered joke in the common room could be interpreted as mockery of Educational Decree Number 29. A book found on a desk, a perfectly acceptable charms textbook, might be suspicious literature if the informant noted that it was bookmarked on the page for anti-authoritarian charms. The ambiguity was deliberate. It allowed Umbridge to act on whims, cloaked in the illusion of order. Luna Lovegood once found herself accused of openly expressing anti-ministry rhetoric. Her only offence had been to say that the ministry was very slow to react when Death Eaters attacked. That sentence, jotted anonymously into the book, became grounds for a full interrogation. She was detained during dinner, her belongings searched, and her copy of the Quibbler confiscated. It took 3 days before she was allowed back into regular classes. No apology, no justification, just a note that she had been re-evaluated and reintegrated. The book itself was protected by layers of enchantments. Not even teachers could access it unless Umbridge granted permission, and she never did, not even Snape. When Flitwick expressed concern about the growing anxiety among his Ravenclaws, Umbridge handed him a pink folder full of assurances and reminded him that order is the highest form of respect. The book was untouchable, a phantom judge, jury, and executioner. Hermione Granger suspected its existence early on. Her suspicion wasn't based on rumour, but on the pattern of detentions. "It's like she knows things she shouldn't," Hermione whispered once in the common room. As if someone is feeding her information, but no one ever says anything. It was Hermione who first coined the term ghost gossip, referring to how private conversations would somehow reach Umbridge's ears. But even she underestimated the scale. Once, a third-year student named Miriam Cresswell was called to Umbridge's office. She had been reported for repeated eye contact and gestures during class. That vague entry was enough to unleash a full investigation into her supposed involvement with Dumbledore's army. She wasn't a member, she barely knew how to hold a wand properly. But she had been observed talking to Susan Bones near the library, and that, combined with the book's notes, was incriminating. The terror wasn't only in being caught, it was in not knowing who accused you. Friendships crumbled under the weight of suspicion. Seamus Finnegan accused Dean Thomas of murmuring charms under his breath in the common room. Dean, furious, confronted him. Seamus denied everything. "I didn't write anything," he swore, and perhaps he didn't. The book didn't require handwriting. It accepted whispered incantations, thoughts written in proximity, even magical intent. That was part of the horror. Even thinking something dark near it could activate a record. One passage in the book, which Harry Potter glimpsed only once, read, "Loitering after lights out. Suspect is passing coded notes, possibly hiding contraband." The name underneath was blurred by enchantments, but the notes were chilling. It referred to a fourth year who had done nothing more than wait for her friend outside the lavatory. She was pulled from her dormitory in the middle of the night. No one saw her for 2 days. Harry himself became a frequent subject. His name appeared so often that Umbridge ordered the book to give out red auras to entries involving him. Red meant imminent threat. But even he was powerless against it. When he asked her directly about the accusations, she merely smiled and said, "If you've done nothing wrong, Mr. Potter, then you have nothing to fear." But everyone feared. The book taught them that innocence was irrelevant, that the system didn't care about truth, it cared about control. What made the book so dangerous wasn't just its content, it was its influence. Students began using it not to protect the school, but to hurt rivals. A Gryffindor accused a Slytherin of cheating, not because he had, but because he had taken her spot on the Quidditch team. A fifth-year Ravenclaw submitted 23 entries in 1 week, later revealed to be her attempt at removing the top students ahead of exams. Even the most innocent hearts became corrupted by the promise of anonymous power. By spring, the book held hundreds of names. It had classified students into vague, color-coded threat levels: green, compliant; yellow, questionable; red, dangerous. Students never saw these labels, but Umbridge did, and she used them to decide who got extra homework, who got search spells cast on their trunks, who was followed by the Inquisitorial squad. There is one account that stands above the rest. Lee Jordan, known for his prankster spirit, was accused of organizing subversive broadcasts. At the time, he was only joking with friends about the idea of a pirate radio station. But the book recorded it. That single entry led to his wand being confiscated for 2 weeks. He was forced to write lines using Umbridge's blood quill, scarring the words, "I will think loyal thoughts," into his skin. It was the book that gave her license. Umbridge believed she was saving Hogwarts. "The students need guidance," she wrote in a private memo. "They must learn to report inappropriate behaviors, To doubt each other is to strengthen the community. This chilling logic turned Hogwarts into a panopticon, a place where you were always seen, always judged, and always one whisper away from punishment. The book was eventually destroyed. After Umbridge's removal, McGonagall found it buried beneath layers of cursed parchment in her office. It took 6 hours and 3 professors to safely dismantle its enchantments. The final tally of names was never made public, but whispers say it contained over 2,000 entries. Most were baseless, some were horrifyingly true, but all were poison. Even years later, when the war had ended and Hogwarts rebuilt itself, students who lived through Umbridge's era spoke of the book in hushed tones. It had scarred them in ways no physical injury could. It had made them doubt each other, doubt themselves. The real damage wasn't the detentions, it was the silence, the turning of friends into informants, the slow erosion of trust. Dolores Umbridge was never punished for creating it. Her crimes were too bureaucratic, too veiled in policy. But among those who remember, there is no doubt, the Book of Informers was her most terrifying invention. It didn't hurt the body, it hurt the soul. And in the darkest corridors of Hogwarts history, that book still lingers, in memory, if not in flesh, a cruel reminder of how fear doesn't always wear a mask. Sometimes it wears a pink cardigan and smiles. Number 25. Symbolic defacement of Dumbledore's portrait. There is a moment buried deep in the lore of Hogwarts, rarely mentioned and completely omitted from the films, yet it reveals more about Dolores Umbridge than any pink cardigan ever could. It was not a curse flung in a hallway, nor a blood quill in motion. It was the quiet, deliberate removal of a portrait, the portrait of Albus Dumbledore, from the headmaster's office after he fled the school. What might seem like a mere administrative decision was, in truth, an act of symbolic violence, an erasure, a silent, malicious attempt to sever the heart of Hogwarts from its spirit. When Dumbledore left the school in the aftermath of the failed attempt to arrest him in Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, his legacy lingered in every stone of the castle. From the warmth of the Great Hall to the quiet strength in the faces of students who had once defied injustice under his name, he remained a presence too vast to erase. But Dolores Umbridge, in her hunger for control and reverence for order, her order, could not abide ghosts she could not silence. The portrait, as tradition dictated, appeared in the headmaster's office upon Dumbledore's departure, just as it had for Armando Dippet before him, and Phineas Nigellus Black before Dippet. But where others had honoured these echoes of guidance, Umbridge sought to lock them away. The decision was not announced. There was no ceremony, no letter to the staff, no note on the office door. What happened was cloaked in secrecy, as so many of her actions were. On a chilly morning in March, when the students were occupied in classes and the corridors were mostly still, 2 members of the Inquisitorial squad, Pansy Parkinson and Warrington, were seen entering the headmaster's tower with Filch trailing behind, carrying an empty gilded frame sack. They emerged an hour later with silence on their lips and a covered rectangle wrapped in velvet floating behind them. The portrait was gone. Dumbledore's face, his serene gaze, the twinkle that had not yet faded from his painted eyes. It had all been smothered and taken away. There were whispers in the corridors. Professor McGonagall was seen pacing in the Transfiguration classroom with clenched fists, her lips white and her eyes like steel. Flitwick, who had always held Dumbledore in quiet awe, cancelled his charms class that afternoon. Even the usually unshakable Hagrid was heard muttering something about her not knowing who she's messin' with now. No one dared speak of it aloud, but the implications were clear. Umbridge had not merely removed a painting, she had declared war on a memory. The act went further than logistics. It wasn't that she needed the space. She rarely used the office, preferring to operate from her own pink, kitten-infested chamber. Nor was it about practicality. Dumbledore's portrait, like those of his predecessors, had offered silent counsel, appearing asleep but always alert when needed. The truth lay in something far deeper. Control over the narrative of Hogwarts. As long as Dumbledore's portrait remained, so did the symbolic reminder of resistance, of disobedience in the name of justice, of strength in love. Umbridge needed to cleanse the castle of his echo, lest it continue to inspire rebellion. There were rumours, of course, rumours that took on lives of their own, whispered between Gryffindor and Hufflepuff common rooms and carried in half-heard mutterings in the corridors. Some claimed that Umbridge had attempted to cast a silencio charm on the portrait before removing it, a charm intended to render it permanently mute. Others insisted that she went further, using a curse, perhaps a modified obliviate, to suppress the memories embedded in the canvas, trying to turn the once vibrant portrait into a blank surface. While no one could confirm whether the spell had succeeded, the very idea sent a chill through the older professors, not because of the act itself, but because of what it represented. In removing the portrait, Umbridge made it clear that she was not only interested in governing the living, she sought dominion over history, over memory, over the lingering strength of ideals she could not manipulate. Dumbledore, long before he was headmaster, had been a symbol of defiance against tyranny. He stood against Grindelwald, against the corrupt undercurrents of the Ministry, and finally against the slow spread of Voldemort's influence even within the walls of power. By covering his portrait, Umbridge sought to cover that part of Hogwarts' soul, as though curtains could be drawn over conscience. There is a striking image recalled by an unnamed Ravenclaw seventh year at the time, later recorded in an underground student zine passed among alumni. She claimed to have snuck into the tower after curfew and peeked into the office through the open crack in the door. Inside, the portrait wall was empty. All former headmasters remained, save for one empty frame, larger than the others, the dust already gathering where Dumbledore's eyes should have watched. That same student remembered the coldness of the room, not from temperature, but from absence. This act, while seemingly petty, mirrored the broader themes of Umbridge's regime. It was no coincidence that she targeted centaurs, banned student organizations, and regulated speech. Everything she touched became subject to censorship and distortion. In removing the portrait, she demonstrated the full extent of her paranoia. A still image of a long-bearded man in half-moon glasses became, in her mind, a threat more dangerous than Peeves or any spell cast in defiance. The portrait could not hex her, it could not rally students, but it could stand as a silent reminder that the throne she sat on had once been ruled by compassion and wisdom, not cruelty and fear. Students like Ginny Weasley, Neville Longbottom, and Luna Lovegood, the heart of Dumbledore's army, took the act as a personal insult. The DA, originally created as a means to learn real defense, had always felt tethered to Dumbledore's spirit. With the portrait gone, they no longer had the illusion of oversight, only the phantom ache of loss. It felt like she had ripped the soul out of the castle, one member wrote years later. As if we weren't just rebelling anymore, we were grieving. Interestingly, when Dumbledore returned and reclaimed the headmaster's post following Umbridge's disgrace and the exposure of Voldemort's return, the portrait was quietly restored. No announcements were made, no official acknowledgement of its absence or its return. It simply reappeared, sitting in the same corner, eyes open, as if it had never left. But some students claimed it never looked the same, that it blinked less often, that it was quieter, more distant. There were those who believed it had been damaged, not physically but symbolically. What made Umbridge's actions particularly chilling was their bureaucratic nature. She operated not through explosive confrontation, but through rules, decrees, and paperwork. Removing the portrait was filed under redecoration for interim administration, and the records of that action were buried under layers of non-essential documentation. The ministry itself made no comment. It was only Madame Pince, the Hogwarts librarian, who once whispered to a curious student that the portrait had been kept in a locked cabinet in the restricted section, shielded from magic. Not even to preserve it, she said, to forget it. Professor McGonagall never spoke of the portrait, but when asked about Umbridge's tenure years later, In an interview with the Daily Prophet, she said only, "Some wounds do not bleed, but they scar all the same." She did not elaborate, and the journalist, perhaps sensing the depth of emotion, did not press further. Yet those who understood Hogwarts knew exactly which wound she referred to. The symbolic erasure of Dumbledore's portrait is more than just a curious footnote. It is a cautionary tale. A reminder of how power, when corrupted, turns its gaze not only toward controlling the present, but reshaping the past. To destroy a portrait is to destroy a story. To silence it is to remove a witness. For Umbridge, it was a strategy of total domination. Deny the students a hero, deny them memory, and you deny them resistance. The absence of this event in the films is conspicuous. They captured her cruelty, her authoritarianism, the surface elements of her tyranny. But this act, the secret war on memory, remains among the most telling of her deeds. It revealed her true nature, not merely as a sadist in pink, but as an eraser of meaning, a destroyer of legacy. The irony, of course, is that her attempt to erase Dumbledore only immortalized him further in the hearts of those who resisted her. The DA became not only a rebellion, but a preservation. Each Protego, each Patronus, each whispered lesson behind room of requirement doors was a brushstroke painting Dumbledore back into the castle walls. They carried his image not on canvas, but in memory. And memory, unlike magic, cannot be locked in a cabinet. It was Hermione who later described Umbridge's rule as the darkest magic of all, making people forget what courage looks like. She wasn't referring to a curse or a hex or even a dementor. She was talking about silence, about removal, about the quiet disappearance of the people and ideas that inspire change. When Dumbledore's portrait was hidden, courage seemed to falter, but it did not vanish. It went underground. It whispered, and in whispers it grew louder. The portrait eventually spoke again. When Harry returned to the office after the Battle of Hogwarts, the painting greeted him. "You've shown bravery beyond imagining," it said, but there was something in the tone, something aged and distant. The painting had watched the fall and rise of Hogwarts from a dark cabinet, away from light and life. And yet it endured. In the end, Umbridge failed. Her attempt to erase Dumbledore's legacy did not weaken it, it magnified it. The portrait, once hidden, became a relic not only of a man, but of an idea. That even in silence, truth remains. That even when forgotten, the right will always find its way back into the light. And so, the greatest curse Umbridge ever cast may have been against a piece of canvas and wood, but it rebounded, as curses often do. And it left behind a story, one too dangerous for the films perhaps, but too important to ever forget. Number 26, Burning Disloyal Textbooks. Of all the many chilling acts Dolores Umbridge committed during her reign at Hogwarts, one stands forgotten in the quiet corners of dusty shelves and ashes swept beneath the stone floorboards. It was not merely her detentions with quills of blood, nor the sugary tyranny she enforced with kitten plates and pink cardigans. There was something darker, more insidious, an act not fully captured in the films, yet deeply symbolic of her authoritarian grip. It was the burning of books, the deliberate destruction of knowledge she deemed unsuitable. Books did not bleed like students, but they suffered under her hand nonetheless. When Umbridge was installed as the Defense Against the Dark Arts professor by the Ministry of Magic, she came bearing the cold voice of bureaucratic control. Her appointment was more than just a reshuffling of faculty. It was a colonization of education. The first target of this invasion was literature, specifically those tomes that dared to speak the truth about dark creatures, spellcasting, dueling, and the turbulent history of magical defense. To Umbridge, truth was dangerous, knowledge was rebellion, and books, if not approved, were enemies. Hogwarts Library, once a sanctuary of magical curiosity and diverse perspectives, became a battlefield. The most affected were the volumes stored in the restricted section, and those scattered across shelves in plain sight, but rich in information, Umbridge sought to bury. Titles like Magical Melee, Defensive, Dueling Through the Ages, Dark Creatures and How to Fight Them, and Bathilda Bagshot's Secret, Histories of Magical Resistance, vanished within days. Madame Pince, the loyal but stern librarian, was powerless. Under Educational Decree No. 24, Umbridge had the right to review and remove any educational materials deemed unfit for institutional use. Some of the confiscated books were taken without notice. Others, more defiantly borrowed by students like Terry Boot and Ginny Weasley, were snatched directly from their arms. When Ginny protested the removal of a copy of Hexes of the Highland Rebellion, Umbridge smiled sweetly and told her, "Such fiction only breeds dissent." That book was never seen again, nor was its author, who had vanished under suspicious circumstances years earlier, a fact which Umbridge chose never to acknowledge. But it wasn't the removal alone that sent ripples of fear through Hogwarts. It was what followed. Deep in the courtyard, one grey October morning, a pyre was built, not for celebration, not for ritual, but for annihilation. A heap of confiscated books lay at its base, some ancient, some recent, all dangerous in her eyes. Without a word to the students, without even a published explanation, Umbridge performed a silent incantation, and flames licked the bindings of centuries-old magic. Among the burning titles was an early edition of The True History of the Dark Arts, a book so old that even Dumbledore had once remarked upon its rarity. The edges of its cracked leather cover curled as it blackened, parchment turned to smoke, and with it the accumulated wisdom of generations. Witnesses later claimed they saw her standing before the blaze with a look not of duty, but of quiet triumph. There was one book in particular that drew the attention of students who knew what had been lost. It was Defiant Spells, Unofficial Defense for the OWL Level Student, written by Wilbert Slinkard's rival, Amelia Vantresca. Unlike Slinkard's dull and docile writings, Vantresca's work challenged young witches and wizards to understand the heart of defensive magic, its unpredictability, its creativity, its role in personal agency. For Umbridge, this was intolerable. "There is no place for improvisation in safety," she once scrawled in the margins of confiscated pages, her cramped cursive like a curse upon the ink. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of the burnings was that Umbridge never justified them publicly. She simply acted, and in that silence, fear grew. Teachers looked the other way. Even Severus Snape, who detested her methods, knew the danger of confronting her while the ministry held sway. The fire became both metaphor and message. If an idea did not conform, it would not be hidden, it would be erased. The films, with their dramatic portrayals of Umbridge's reign of terror, never showed this literary purge. They depicted the harsh detentions, the decrees on the walls, the cruel smile behind every hem, but they missed the quiet violence of cultural erasure. A classroom can recover from bruises, a library cannot so easily replace lost thought. Hermione Granger, perhaps the only student with the courage and foresight to record what was happening, wrote privately in her notes, "They are not just taking books, they are stealing our right to think freely. Knowledge is not noise, it is resistance." She later retrieved scraps of burned pages from the ashes in the courtyard, wrapping them in cloth and hiding them beneath a floorboard in the Gryffindor common room. Among the remains, one could still read a single phrase from a ruined chapter. "The first spell of defense is knowing who you are." It's important to note that even before the final burning, Umbridge had attempted subtler forms of control. She demanded edited copies of Hogwarts textbooks. She asked for annotations to be removed, especially those that referenced real-world dueling or alternative methods not sanctioned by the ministry. She replaced entire chapters with her own ministry-approved inserts, dry, colourless pages that taught obedience rather than understanding. One particular victim was Magical Defense for the Modern Mind by Elspeth Harridan, a Ravenclaw graduate turned Auror. Harridan's work was lauded for its blend of historical context and practical application. Umbridge called it incendiary, and had it pulled not only from Hogwarts but from Flourish and Blots in Diagon Alley. A student named Anthony Goldstein later revealed that he had once read it in secret, tried to replicate some of its shielding spells, They worked better than anything Slinkhard ever offered, he muttered, his voice bitter. The tragedy of the burnings was that many students never knew what had been lost. First years, wide-eyed and eager, thought the sparse shelves were normal. They assumed that ministry books were the only books. And slowly, through this careful pruning, Umbridge sculpted a new Hogwarts, a place where danger was not faced, but denied. A place where the past was redacted. But fire, even when used as a tool of control, leaves behind echoes. The scent of burning parchment lingered for days. Students whispered of secret readings, hidden copies, shared notes. The room of requirement became a sanctuary for forbidden learning. There, Hermione and others began collecting any scraps of knowledge they could find. Hidden pages, rescued essays, even oral retellings of banned stories. In this underground movement, knowledge took on a sacred quality passed from voice to voice like spells that couldn't be burned. Fred and George Weasley, while known for their pranks, played a part in this resistance as well. They created enchanted covers for books that made them look like copies of Hogwarts, a history. In truth, many of them contained entire chapters of the banned dueling texts or essays by dissenting scholars. In this way, even as the fire consumed, students found ways to preserve what they could. Not all teachers agreed with the purges, of course. Professor Flitwick reportedly kept a secret stash of defensive books in a locked cabinet behind a portrait of a sleepy troll. He lent them only to students he trusted, and only at night, whispering, "Some truths are worth the risk." These acts of quiet rebellion became lifelines for those students who refused to accept the narrative Umbridge imposed. What Dolores Umbridge did with those flames was more than censorship. It was an attempt to redefine magic itself. In her world, magic was neat, orderly, polite, an extension of government, not a force of nature or personal truth. And yet, even in her strongest moment, she could not burn everything. She could not incinerate memory.